The Angel of the Odd by Edgar Allan Poe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Patrick Lockhart. It was a chilly November afternoon. I had just consummated an unusually hearty dinner, of which the dyspeptic truff formed not the least important item, and was sitting alone in the dining-room. With my feet upon the fender, and at my elbow a small table which I had rolled up to the fire, and upon which were some apologies for dessert, with some miscellaneous bottles of wine, spirit, and liquor. In the morning I had been reading Glover's Leonidas, Wilkie's Epiconiad, Lamartine's Pilgrimage, Barlow's Columbiad, Tuckerman's Sicily, and Griswold's Curiosities. I am willing to confess, therefore, that I now felt a little stupid. I made effort to arouse myself by frequent aid of Lafitte, and all failing, I betook myself to a stray newspaper in despair. Having carefully perused the column of Houses to Let, and the column of Dogs Lost, and then the columns of Wives and Apprentices Run Away, I attacked with great resolution the editorial matter, and reading it from beginning to end without understanding a syllable, conceived the possibility of its being Chinese, and so reread it from the end to the beginning, but with no more satisfactory result. I was about throwing it away in disgust, this folio of 4 pages, happy work which not even the critics criticize, when I felt my attention somewhat aroused by the paragraph which follows. The avenues to death are numerous and strange. A London paper mentions the decease of a person from a singular cause. He was playing at Puff the Dart, which is played with a long needle inserted in some worsted, and blown at a target through a tin tube. He placed the needle at the wrong end of the tube, and drawing his breath strongly to puff the dart forward with force, drew the needle into his throat. It entered the lungs, and in a few days killed him. Upon seeing this, I fell into a great rage, without exactly knowing why. "This thing," I exclaimed, "is a contemptible falsehood, a poor hoax, the lees of the invention of some pitiable penny-a-liner, of some wretched concocter of accidents in cocaine. These fellows, knowing the extravagant gullibility of the age, set their wits to work in the imagination of improbable possibilities, of odd accidents, as they term them. But to a reflecting intellect, like mine," I added, in parentheses, putting my forefinger unconsciously to the side of my nose, "to a contemplative understanding such as I myself possess, it seems evident at once that the marvelous increase of late in these odd accidents is by far the oddest accident of all. For my own part, I intend to believe nothing henceforward that has anything of the singular about it." "Mein Gott, then! What a fool you bees for that!" replied one of the most remarkable voices I have ever heard. At first I took it for a rumbling in my ears, such as a man sometimes experiences when getting very drunk. But upon second thought, I considered the sound as more nearly resembling that which proceeds from an empty barrel beaten with a big stick. And, in fact, this I should have concluded it to be, but for the articulation of the syllables and words. I am by no means naturally nervous, and the very few glasses of Lafitte which I had sipped served to embolden me a little, so that I felt nothing of trepidation, but merely uplifted my eyes with a leisurely movement and looked carefully around the room for the intruder. I could not, however, perceive any one at all. "Humph!" resumed the voice as I continued my survey. "You must be so drunk as the pig, then, for not see me as I sit here by your side." Hereupon I bethought me of looking immediately before my nose, and there, sure enough, confronting me at the table, sat a personage nondescript, although not altogether indescribable. His body was a wine-pipe, or a rum-puncheon, or something of that character, and had a truly Falstaffian air. In its nether extremity were inserted 2 kegs, which seemed to answer all the purposes of legs. For arms there were dangled from the upper portion of the carcass 2 tolerably long bottles with the necks outward for hands. All the head that I saw of the monster possessed of was one of those Hessian canteens, which resemble a large snuff-box, with a hole in the middle of the lid. This canteen, with a funnel on its top like a cavalier cap slouched over the eyes, was set on edge upon the puncheon, with a hole toward myself. And through this hole, which seemed puckered up like the mouth of a very precise old maid, The creature was emitting certain rumbling and grumbling noises which he evidently intended for intelligible talk. "I say," said he, "you must be drunk as the pig, for zit there and not see me zit here. And I say, do, you must be bigger fool as the goose, for to disbelieve what is print in the print. 'Tis the truth, that it is, every word of it." "Who are you, I pray?" said I, with much dignity, although somewhat puzzled. "How did you get here, and what is it you're talking about?" "As for how I comed here," replied the figure, "that is none of your business. As for what I be talking about, I be talk about what I think proper. And as for who I be, why that is the very thing I come for to let you see for yourself." "You're a drunken vagabond," said I, "and I shall ring the bell and order my footman to kick you into the street." "He, he," said the fellow, "that you can't do." "Can't do," said I. "What do you mean, I can't do what?" "Ring the bell," he replied, attempting a grin with his little villainous mouth. Upon this I made an effort to get up in order to put my threat into execution. But the ruffian just reached across the table, very deliberately, and hitting me a tap on the forehead with the neck of one of the long bottles, knocked me back into the armchair from which I had half arisen. I was utterly astounded, and for a moment was quite at a loss what to do. In the meantime he continued his talk. "You see," said he, "it is best for to sit still. And now you shall know who I be. Look at me. See, I am the angel of the odd." "And odd enough, too," I ventured to reply. "But I was always under the impression that an angel had wings." "The wing!" he cried, highly incensed. "What I be do mit the wing? Mein Gott, you take me for a chicken?" "No, no," I replied, much alarmed. "You're no chicken, certainly not." "Well then, sit still and behave yourself, or I'll rap you again mid the visit. It is the chicken ab the wing, und the owl ab the wing, und the imp ab the wing, und the head truffle ab the wing. The angel ab not the wing, and I am the angel of the odd." "And your business with me at present is—" "Me business!" ejaculated the thing. "Why, what a low-bred puppy you must be for to ask a gentleman and an angel about his business." This language was rather more than I could bear, even from an angel. So plucking up courage, I seized a salt-cellar which lay within reach, and hurled it at the head of the intruder. Either he dodged, however, or my aim was inaccurate, for all I accomplished was to demolish the crystal which protected the dial of the clock upon the mantelpiece. As for the angel, he evinced his sense of my assault by giving me 2 or 3 hard consecutive raps upon the forehead as before. Hereupon the angel of the odd replenished my goblet, which was about a third full of port, with a colorless fluid that he poured from one of his hand bottles. I observed that these bottles had labels about their necks, and that these labels were inscribed Kirchenwasser. The considerate kindness of the angel mollified me in no little measure, and, aided by the water, which he diluted my port more than once, I at length regained sufficient temper to listen to his very extraordinary discourse. I cannot pretend to recount all that he told me, but I gleaned from what he said that he was a genius who presided over the contretemps of mankind, and whose business it was to bring about the odd accidents which are continually astonishing the skeptic. Once or twice, upon my venturing to express my total incredulity in respect to his pretensions, he grew very angry indeed, so that at length I considered it the wiser policy to say nothing at all, and let him have his own way. He talked on, therefore, at great length, while I merely leaned back in my chair with my eyes shut, and amused myself with munching raisins and flipping the stems about the room. But by and by the angel suddenly construed this behavior of mine into contempt. He arose in a terrible passion, slouched his funnel down over his eyes, swore a vast oath, uttered a threat of some character which I did not precisely comprehend, and finally made me a low bow and departed, wishing me, in the language of the Archbishop in Gil Blas, beaucoup de bonheur et un peu plus de bon sens. His departure afforded me relief. The very few glasses of Lafitte that I had sipped had the effect of rendering me drowsy, and I felt inclined to take a nap of some 15 or 20 minutes, as is my custom after dinner. At 6 I had an appointment of consequence, which it was quite indispensable that I should keep. The policy of insurance for my dwelling-house had expired the day before, and some dispute having arisen, it was agreed that, at 6, I should meet the board of directors of the company and settle the terms of a renewal. Glancing upward at the clock on the mantelpiece, for I felt too drowsy to take out my watch, I had the pleasure to find that I still had 25 minutes to spare. It was 5:30. I could easily walk to the insurance office in 5 minutes, and my usual siestas had never been known to exceed 25. I felt sufficiently safe, therefore, and composed myself to my slumbers forthwith. Having completed them to my satisfaction, I again looked toward the timepiece, and was half inclined to believe in the possibility of odd accidents when I found that, instead of my ordinary 15 or 20 minutes, I had been dozing only 3, for it still wanted 7:20 of the appointed hour. I betook myself again to my nap, and at length a second time awoke, when, to my utter amazement, it still wanted 27 minutes of 6. I jumped up to examine the clock, and found that it had ceased running. My watch informed me that it was 7:30, and, of course, having slept 2 hours, I was too late for my appointment. "It will make no difference," I said. "I can call at the office in the morning and apologize. In the meantime, what can be the matter of the clock?" Upon examining it, I discovered that one of the raisin stems which I had been filliping about the room during the discourse of the Angel of the Odd had flown through the fractured crystal, and, lodging singularly enough in the keyhole, with an end projecting outward, had thus arrested the revolution of the minute-hand. "Ah," said I see how it is. This thing speaks for itself. A natural accident, such as will happen now and then." I gave the matter no further consideration, and at my usual hour retired to bed. Here, having placed a candle upon a reading-stand at the bed-head, and having made an attempt to peruse some pages of the Omnipresence of the Deity, I unfortunately fell asleep in less than 20 seconds, leaving the light burning as it was. My dreams were terribly disturbed by visions of the Angel of the Odd. Methought he stood at the foot of the couch, drew aside the curtains, and in the hollow, detestable tones of a rum puncheon menaced me with the bitterest vengeance for the contempt which I had treated him. He concluded a long harangue by taking off his funnel cap, inserting the tube into my gullet, and thus deluging me with an ocean of Kirschenwasser, which he poured in a continuous flood from one of the long-necked bottles that stood him instead of an arm. My agony was at length insufferable, and I awoke just in time to perceive that a rat had run off with a lighted candle from the stand, but not in season to prevent his making his escape with it through the hole. Very soon a strong, suffocating odor assailed my nostrils. The house, I clearly perceived, was on fire. In a few minutes the blaze broke forth with violence, and in an incredibly brief period the entire building, all egress from my chamber, except through a window, was cut off. The crowd, however, quickly procured and raised a long ladder. By means of this I was descending rapidly, and in apparent safety, when a huge hog, about whose rotund stomach, and indeed about whose whole air and physiognomy, there was something which reminded me of the Angel of the Odd, when this hog, I say, which hitherto had been quietly slumbering in the mud, took it suddenly into its head that his left shoulder needed scratching, and could find no more convenient rubbing-post than that afforded by the foot of the ladder. In an instant I was precipitated, and had the misfortune to fracture my arm. This accident, with the loss of my insurance, and the more serious loss of my hair, the whole of which had been singed off by the fire, predisposed me to serious impressions, so that finally I made up my mind to take a wife. There was a rich widow, disconsolate for the loss of her 7th husband, and to her wounded spirit I offered the balm of my vows. She yielded a reluctant consent to my prayers. I knelt at her feet in gratitude and adoration. She blushed and bowed her luxuriant tresses in close contact with those supplied me temporarily by Grand Jean. I know not how the entanglement took place, but so it was. I arose with a shining pate, wigless, she in disdain and wrath, half buried in alien hair. Thus ended my hopes of the widow by an accident which could not have been anticipated, to be sure, but which the natural sequence of events had brought about. Without despairing, however, I undertook the siege of a less implacable heart. The fates were again propitious for a brief period, but again a trivial incident interfered. Meeting my betrothed in an avenue thronged with the elite of the city, I was hastening to greet her with one of my best considered bows, when a small particle of some foreign matter lodging in the corner of my eye rendered me for the moment completely blind. Before I could recover my sight, the lady of my love had disappeared, irreparably affronted at what she chose to consider my premeditated rudeness in passing her by ungreeted. While I had stood bewildered at the suddenness of this accident, which might have happened nevertheless to anyone under the sun, and while I still continued incapable of sight, I was accosted by the Angel of the Odd, who proffered me his aid with a civility which I had no reason to expect. He examined my disordered eye with much gentleness and skill, informed me that I had a drop in it, and, whatever a drop was, took it out and afforded me relief. I now considered it high time to die, since fortune had so determined to persecute me, and accordingly made my way to the nearest river. Here, divesting myself of my clothes, for there is no reason why we cannot die as we were born, I threw myself headlong into the current, sole witness of my fate being a solitary crow that had been seduced into the eating of brandy-saturated corn, and so had staggered away from his fellows. No sooner had I entered the water than this bird took it into his head to fly away with the most indispensable portion of my apparel. Postponing, therefore, for the present, my suicidal design, I just slipped my nether extremities into the sleeves of my coat, and betook myself to a pursuit of the felon with all the nimbleness which the case required, and its circumstances would admit. But my evil destiny attended me still. As I ran at full speed, with my nose up in the atmosphere, and intent only upon the purloiner of my property, I suddenly perceived that my feet rested no longer upon terra firma. The fact is, I had thrown myself over a precipice, and should inevitably have been dashed to pieces but for my good fortune in grasping the end of a long guide-rope, which depended from a passing balloon. As soon as I sufficiently recovered my senses to comprehend the terrific predicament in which I stood, or rather hung, I exerted all the power of my lungs to make that predicament known to the aeronaut overhead. But for a long time I exerted myself in vain. Either the fool could not, or the villain would not, perceive me. Meanwhile the machine rapidly soared, while my strength even more rapidly failed. I was soon upon the point of resigning myself to my fate, and dropping quietly into the sea, when my spirits were suddenly revived by hearing a hollow voice from above, which seemed to be lazily humming an opera. Looking up, I perceived the Angel of the Odd. He was leaning with his arms folded over the rim of the car, and with a pipe in his mouth, at which he puffed leisurely, seemed to be upon excellent terms with himself and the universe. I was too much exhausted to speak, so I merely regarded him with an imploring air. For several minutes, although he looked me full in the face, he said nothing. At length, removing carefully his meerschaum from the right to the left corner of his mouth, he condescended to speak. "Who be you?" he asked. "And what der Teufel you be to there?" To this piece of impudence, cruelty, and affectation, I could reply only by ejaculating the monosyllable, "Help!" "Help!" echoed the ruffian. "Not I. There is the bottle. Help yourself, and be damned." With these words he let fall a heavy bottle of Kirschenwasser, which, dropping precisely upon the crown of my head, caused me to imagine that my brains were entirely knocked out. Impressed with this idea, I was about to relinquish my hold and give up the ghost with a good grace, when I was arrested by the cry of the angel, who bade me hold on. "Hold on," he said. "Don't be in a hurry. Don't. Will you be to take all the bottle, or have you got to be sober yet, or come to your senses?" I made haste hereupon to nod my head twice, once in the negative, meaning thereby that I would prefer not taking the other bottle at present, and once in the affirmative, intending thus to imply that I was sober and had positively come to my senses. By these means I somewhat softened the angel. "And you believe, then," he inquired, "at the last you believe, then, in the possibility of the art?" I again nodded my head in assent. "And you have belief in me, the angel of the art?" I nodded again. "And you acknowledge that you be the blind drunk and the fool?" I nodded once more. "Put your right hand into your left breeches pocket, then, in token of your full submission unto the angel of the art." This thing, for very obvious reasons, I found it quite impossible to do. In the first place, my left arm had been broken in my fall from the ladder, and therefore, had I let go my hold with my right hand, I must have let go altogether. In the second place, I could have no breeches until I came across the crow, and I was therefore obliged, much to my regret, to shake my head in the negative, intending thus to give the angel to understand that I found it inconvenient, just at that moment, to comply with his very reasonable demand. No sooner, however, had I ceased shaking my head than "Go to der Teufel, ten!" roared the Angel of the Odd. In pronouncing these words he drew a sharp knife across the guide rope by which I was suspended, and as we then happened to be precisely over my own house, which during my peregrinations had been handsomely rebuilt, it so occurred that I tumbled headlong down the ample chimney and alit upon the dining-room hearth. Upon coming to my senses, for the fall had very thoroughly stunned me, I found it about 4 o'clock in the morning. I lay outstretched where I had fallen from the balloon. My head grovelled in the ashes of an extinguished fire, while my feet reposed upon the wreck of a small table, overthrown, and amid the fragments of a miscellaneous desert, intermingled with a newspaper, some broken glasses and shattered bottles, and an empty jug of the Schiedam Kirschenwasser. Thus revenged himself the Angel of the Odd. End of The Angel of the Odd. Recording by David Patrick Lockard, Hampton, Virginia, USA.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Problem by Anton Chekhov. Read for LibriVox.org by Alan Davis Drake. The strictest measures were taken that the Yuskovs' family secret might not leak out and become generally known. Half of the servants were sent off to the theatre or the circus, and another half were sitting in the kitchen and not allowed to leave it. Orders were given that no one was to be admitted. The wife of the colonel, her sister, and the governess, though they had been initiated into the secret, kept up a pretense of knowing nothing. They sat in the dining-room and did not show themselves in the drawing-room or the hall. Sasha Yuskov, the young man of 25 who was the cause of all the commotion, had arrived some time before, and by the advice of kind-hearted Ivan Markovitch, his uncle, who was taking his part, he sat meekly in the hall by the door leading to the study, and prepared himself to make an open, candid explanation. The other side of the door, in the study, a family council was being held. The subject under discussion was an exceedingly disagreeable and delicate one. Sasha Yuskov had cashed at one of the banks a false promissory note, and it had become due for payment 3 days before, and now his two paternal uncles and Ivan Markovitch, the brother of his dead mother, were deciding the question whether they should pay the money and save the family honor, or wash their hands of it and leave the case to go for trial. To outsiders who have no personal interest in the matter, such questions seem simple. For those who are so unfortunate as to have to decide them in earnest, they are extremely difficult. The uncles had been talking for a long time, but the problem seemed no nearer decision. "My friends," said the uncle who was a colonel, and there was a note of exhaustion and bitterness in his voice, "who says that family honor is a mere convention? I don't say that at all. I am only warning you against the false view. I am pointing out the possibility of an unpardonable mistake. How can you fail to see it? I am not speaking Chinese. I am speaking Russian." "My dear fellow, we do understand," Ivan Markovitch protested mildly. "How can you understand if you say that I don't believe in family honor? I repeat once more, family honor, falsely understood, is a prejudice. Falsely understood. That's what I say. Whatever may be the motives for screening a scoundrel, whoever he may be, and helping him to escape punishment, it is contrary to law and unworthy of a gentleman. It's not saving the family honor, it's civil cowardice. Take the army, for instance. The honor of the army is more precious to us than any other honor. Yet we don't screen our guilty members, but condemn them. And does the honor of the army suffer in consequence? Quite the contrary." The other paternal uncle, an official in the treasury, a taciturn, dull-witted, and rheumatic man, sat silent, or spoke only of the fact that the Uskov's name would get into the newspapers if the case went for trial. His opinion was that the case ought to be hushed up from the first and not become public property. But apart from publicity in the newspapers, he advanced no other argument in support of his opinion. The maternal uncle, kind-hearted Ivan Markovitch, spoke smoothly, softly, and with a tremor in his voice. He began with saying that youth has its rights and peculiar temperaments. Which of us has not been young? And who has not been led astray? To say nothing of ordinary mortals, even great men have not escaped errors and mistakes in their youth. Take, for instance, the biography of great writers. Did not every one of them gamble, drink, and draw down upon himself the anger of right-thinking people in his young days? If Sasha's error bordered upon crime, they must remember that Sasha had received practically no education. He had been expelled from the high school in the 5th class. He had lost his parents in early childhood, and so had been left at the tenderest age without guidance and good benevolent influences. He was nervous, excitable, and had no firm ground under his feet, and above all, he had been unlucky. Even if he were guilty, anyway, he deserved indulgence and the sympathy of all compassionate souls. He ought, of course, to be punished, but he was punished as it was by his conscience and the agonies he was enduring now, while awaiting the sentence of his relations. The comparison with the army made by the colonel was delightful, and did credit to his lofty intelligence. His appeal to their feeling of public duty spoke for the chivalry of his soul. But they must not forget that in each individual the citizen is closely linked with the Christian. "Shall we be false to civic duty," Ivan Markovitch exclaimed passionately, "if, instead of punishing an erring boy, we hold out to him a helping hand?" Ivan Markovitch talked further of family honor. He had not the honor to belong to the Uskov family himself, but he knew their distinguished family went back to the 13th century. He did not forget for a minute, either, that his precious beloved sister had been the wife of one of the representatives of that name. In short, the family was dear to him for many reasons, and he refused to admit the idea that, for the sake of a paltry 1,500 roubles, a blot would be cast on the escutcheon that was beyond all price. If all the motives he had brought forward were not sufficiently convincing, he, Ivan Markovitch, in conclusion, begged his listeners to ask themselves what was meant by crime. Crime is an immoral act founded upon ill will. But is the will of man free? Philosophy has not yet given a positive answer to that question. Different views were held by the learned. The latest school of Lombroso, for instance, denies the freedom of the will, and considers every crime as the product of the purely anatomical peculiarities of the individual. "Ivan Markovitch," said the colonel, in a voice of entreaty, "we are talking seriously about an important matter, and you bring in Lombroso? You clever fellow! Think a little. What are you saying all this for? Can you imagine that all your thunderings and rhetoric will furnish an answer to the questions?" Sasha Uskov sat at the door and listened. He felt neither terror, shame, nor depression, but only weariness and inward emptiness. It seemed to him that it made absolutely no difference to him whether they forgave him or not. He had come here to hear his sentence and to explain himself simply, because kind-hearted Ivan Markovitch had begged him to do so. He was not afraid of the future. It made no difference to him where he was, here in the hall, in prison, or in Siberia. If Siberia, then let it be Siberia, damn it all! He was sick of life, and found it insufferably hard. He was inextricably involved in debt. He had not a farthing in his pocket. His family had become detestable to him. He would have to part from his friends and his women sooner or later, and they had begun to be too contemptuous of his sponging on them. The future looked black. Sasha was indifferent, and was only disturbed by one circumstance. The other side of the door they were calling him a scoundrel and a criminal. Every minute he was on the point of jumping up, bursting into the study, and shouting in answer to the detestable metallic voice of the colonel, "You are lying!" Criminal was a dreadful word. That is what murderers, thieves, robbers are. In fact, wicked and morally hopeless people. And Sasha was very far from being all that. It was true he owed a great deal, and did not pay his debts. But debt is not a crime, and it is unusual for a man not to be in debt. The colonel and Ivan Markovitch were both in debt. What have I done wrong besides? Sasha wondered. He had discounted a forged note, but all the young men he knew did the same. Handrikov and von Burst always forged IOUs from their parents or friends when their allowances were not paid at the regular time, and then when they got their money from home they redeemed them before they became due. Sasha had done the same, but had not redeemed the IOU because he had not got the money which Handrikov had promised to lend him. He was not to blame. It was the fault of circumstances. It was true that the use of another person's signature was considered reprehensible, but still it was not a crime, but a generally accepted dodge, an ugly formality which injured no one and was quite harmless, for in forging the colonel's signature Sasha had had no intention of causing anybody damage or loss. "No, it doesn't mean that I am criminal," thought Sasha, "and it's not in my character to bring myself to commit a crime. I am soft, emotional. When I have money, I help the poor." Sasha was musing after this fashion while they went on talking the other side of the door. "But, my friends, this is endless," the colonel declared, getting excited. "Suppose we were to forgive him and pay the money. You know he would not give up leading a dissipated life, squandering money, making debts, going to our tailors and ordering suits in our names. Can you guarantee that this will be his last prank? As far as I'm concerned, I have no faith whatever in his reforming." The official of the treasury muttered something in reply. After him Ivan Markovitch began talking blandly and suavely again. The colonel moved his chair impatiently and drowned the other's words with his detestable metallic voice. At last the door opened and Ivan Markovitch came out of the study. There were patches of red on his lean shaven face. "Come along," he said, taking Sasha by the hand. "Come, and speak frankly from your heart, without pride, my dear boy, humbly and from the heart." Sasha went into the study. The official of the treasury was sitting down. The colonel was standing before the table with one hand in his pocket and one knee on a chair. It was smoky and stifling in the study. Sasha did not look at the official or the colonel. He felt suddenly ashamed and uncomfortable. He looked uneasily at Ivan Markovitch and muttered, "I'll pay it. I will give it back." "What did you expect when you discounted the IOU?" he heard a metallic voice. Handrikov promised to lend me the money before now." Sasha could say no more. He went out of the study and sat down again on the chair near the door. He would have been glad to go away altogether at once, but he was choking with hatred, and he awfully wanted to remain, to tear the colonel to pieces, to say something rude to him. He sat, trying to think of something violent and effective to say to his hated uncle, and at that moment a woman's figure, shrouded in the twilight, appeared at the drawing-room door. It was the colonel's wife. She beckoned Sasha to her, and wringing her hands, said, weeping, "Alexandre, I know you don't like me, but listen to me, listen, I beg you. But, my dear, how can this have happened? Why, it's awful, awful! For goodness' sake, beg them, defend yourself, entreat them." Sasha looked at her quivering shoulders, at the big tears that were rolling down her cheeks, hearing behind his back the hollow, nervous voice of worried and exhausted people, and shrugged his shoulders. He had not in the least expected that his aristocratic relations would raise such a tempest over a paltry 1,500 roubles. He could not understand her tears, nor the quiver of their voices. An hour later he heard that the colonel was getting the best of it. The uncles were finally inclining to let the case go for trial. "The matter's settled," said the colonel, sighing. "Enough." After this decision all the uncles, even the emphatic colonel, became noticeably depressed. A silence followed. "Merciful heavens!" sighed Ivan Markovitch. "My poor sister!" And he began saying in a subdued voice that most likely his sister, Sasha's mother, was present unseen in the study at that moment. He felt in his soul how the unhappy, saintly woman was weeping, grieving, and begging for her boy. For the sake of her peace beyond the grave, they ought to spare Sasha. The sound of a muffled sob was heard. Ivan Markovitch was weeping and muttering something which was impossible to catch through the door. The colonel got up and paced from corner to corner. The long conversation began over again. But then the clock in the drawing-room struck 2. The family council was over. To avoid seeing the person who had moved him to such wrath, the colonel went from the study, not into the hall, but into the vestibule. Ivan Markovitch came out into the hall. He was agitated and rubbing his hands joyfully. His tear-stained eyes looked good-humoured, and his mouth was twisted into a smile. "Capital!" he said to Sasha. "Thank God! You can go home, my dear, and sleep tranquilly. We have decided to pay the sum, but on condition that you repent and come with me to-morrow into the country and set to work." A minute later Ivan Markovitch and Sasha, in their greatcoats and caps, were going down the stairs. The uncle was muttering something edifying. Sasha did not listen, but he felt as though some uneasy weight were gradually slipping off his shoulders. They had forgiven him. He was free. A gust of joy sprang up within him and sent a sweet chill to his heart. He longed to breathe, to move swiftly, to live. Glancing at the street lamps and the black sky, he remembered that Von Burst was celebrating his name-day that evening at the Bear, and again a rush of joy flooded his soul. "I am going," he decided. But then he remembered he had not a farthing, that the companions he was going to would despise him at once for his empty pockets. He must get hold of some money, come what may. "Uncle, lend me 100 roubles," he said to Ivan Markovitch. His uncle surprised, looked into his face, and backed against the lamp-post. "Give it to me," said Sasha, shifting impatiently from one foot to the other, and beginning to pant. "Uncle, I entreat you, give me 100 roubles." His face worked, he trembled, and he seemed on the point of attacking his uncle. "Won't you?" he kept asking, seeing that his uncle was still amazed and did not understand. "Listen, if you don't, I'll give myself up tomorrow. I won't let you pay the IOU. I'll present another false note tomorrow." Petrified, muttering something incoherent in his horror, Ivan Markovitch took 100-rouble note out of his pocket-book and gave it to Sasha. The young man took it and walked rapidly away from him. Taking a sledge, Sasha grew calmer, and felt a rush of joy within him again. The rights of youth of which kind-hearted Ivan Markovitch had spoken at the family council woke up and asserted themselves. Sasha pictured the drinking party before him, and among the bottles, the women and his friends, the thought flashed through his mind, "Now I see that I am a criminal. Yes, I am a criminal." End of The Problem by Anton Chekhov. This recording is in the public domain.
The Bureau d'Échange de Mots by Lord Dunsany. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or how to volunteer, go to LibriVox.org. This recording by James Christopher. I often think of the Bureau d'Échange de Mots and the wondrously evil old man that sat therein. It stood in a little street that there is in Paris, its doorway made of 3 brown beams of wood, the top one overlapping the others like the Greek letter pi, all the rest painted green, a house far lower and narrower than its neighbors, and infinitely stranger, a thing to take one's fancy. And over the doorway, on the old brown beam in faded yellow letters, this legend ran, Bureau Universal d'Échange de Mots. I entered at once and accosted the listless man that lolled on a stool by his counter. I demanded the wherefore of his wonderful house, what evil wares he exchanged, with many other things that I wished to know, for curiosity led me. And indeed, had it not, I had gone at once from that shop, for there was so evil a look in that fattened man, and the hang of his fallen cheeks, and his sinful eye, that you would have said he had had dealings with hell and won the advantage by sheer wickedness. Such a man was mine host, but above all, the evil of him lay in his eyes, which lay so still, so apathetic, that you would have sworn that he was drugged or dead. Like lizards motionless on a wall they lay, then suddenly they darted, and all his cunning flamed up and revealed itself in what one moment before seemed no more than a sleepy and ordinary wicked old man. And this was the object and trade of that peculiar shop, the Bureau Universal d'Échange de Mots. You paid 20 francs, which the old man proceeded to take from me, for admission to the bureau, and then had the right to exchange any evil or misfortune with anyone on the premises for some evil or misfortune that he could afford, as the old man put it. There were 4 or 5 men in the dingy ends of that low-ceilinged room who gesticulated and muttered softly in twos as men who make a bargain, and now and then more came in, and the eyes of the flabby owner of the house leaped up at them as they entered, seemed to know their errands at once and each one's peculiar need, and fell back again into somnolence, receiving his 20 francs in an almost lifeless hand, and biting the coin as though in pure absence of mind. Some of my clients, he told me, so amazing to me was the trade of this extraordinary shop that I engaged the old man in conversation, repulsive though he was, and from his garrulity I gathered these facts. He spoke in perfect English, though his utterance was somewhat thick and heavy. No language seemed to come amiss to him. He had been in business a great many years, how many he would not say, and was far older than he looked. All kinds of people did business in his shop. What they exchanged with each other he did not care, except that it had to be evils. He was not empowered to carry on any other kind of business. There was no evil, he told me, that was not negotiable there. No evil the old man knew had ever been taken away in despair from his shop. A man might have to wait and come back next day, and the day after, paying 20 francs each time. But the old man had the addresses of all his clients, and shrewdly knew their needs. And soon, the right two met and eagerly exchanged their commodities. Commodities was the old man's terrible word, said with a gruesome smack of his heavy lips, for he took pride in his business, and evils to him were goods. I learned from him in 10 minutes very much of human nature, more than I have ever learned from any other man. I learned from him that a man's own evil is to him the worst thing there is or ever could be, and that an evil so unbalances all men's minds that they always seek for extremes in that small, grim shop. A woman that had no children had exchanged with an impoverished, half-maddened creature with 12. On one occasion, a man had exchanged wisdom for folly. Why on earth did he do that? I said. None of my business, the old man answered in his heavy, indolent way. He merely took his 20 francs from each and ratified the agreement in the little room at the back opening out of the shop where his clients do business. Apparently, the man that had parted with wisdom had left the shop upon the tips of his toes with a happy though foolish expression all over his face. But the other went thoughtfully away, wearing a troubled and very puzzled look. Almost always, it seemed, they did business in opposite evils. But the thing that puzzled me most in all my talks with that unwieldy man, the thing that puzzles me still, is that none that had once done business in that shop ever returned again. A man might come day after day for many weeks, but once do business, and he never returned. So much the old man told me, but when I asked him why, he only muttered that he did not know. It was to discover the wherefore of this strange thing, and for no other reason at all, that I determined myself to do business sooner or later in the little room at the back of that mysterious shop. I determined to exchange some very trivial evil for some evil equally slight, to seek for myself an advantage so very small as scarcely to give fate as it were a grip. For I deeply distrusted these bargains, knowing well that man has never yet benefited by the marvelous, and that the more miraculous his advantage appears to be, the more securely and tightly do the gods or the witches catch him. In a few days more I was going back to England, and I was beginning to fear that I should be seasick. This fear of seasickness, not the actual malady, but only the mere fear of it, I decided to exchange for a suitably little evil. I did not know with whom I should be dealing, who in reality was the head of the firm. One never does when shopping. But I decided that neither Jew nor devil could make very much on so small a bargain as that. I told the old man my project, and he scoffed at the smallness of my commodity, trying to urge me to some darker bargain, but could not move me from my purpose. And then he told me tales with a somewhat boastful air of the big business, the great bargains that had passed through his hands. A man had once run in there to try and exchange death. He had swallowed poison by accident, and had only 12 hours to live. That sinister old man had been able to oblige him. A client was willing to exchange the commodity. But what did he give in exchange for death? I said. Life, said that grim old man with a furtive chuckle. It must have been a horrible life, I said. That was not my affair, the proprietor said, lazily rattling together as he spoke a little pocketful of 20-franc pieces. Strange business I watched in that shop for the next few days, the exchange of odd commodities, and heard strange mutterings in corners amongst couples who presently rose and went to the back room, the old man following to ratify. Twice a day for a week I paid my 20 francs, watching life with its great needs and its little needs morning and afternoon spread out before me in all its wonderful variety. And one day I met a comfortable man with only a little need. He seemed to have the very evil I wanted. He always feared the lift was going to break. I knew too much of hydraulics to fear things as silly as that, but it was not my business to cure his ridiculous fear. Very few words were needed to convince him that mine was the evil for him. He never crossed the sea, and I, on the other hand, could always walk upstairs. And I also felt at the time, as many must feel in that shop, that so absurd a fear could never trouble me. And yet at times it is almost the curse of my life. When we both had signed the parchment in the spidery back room, and the old man had signed and ratified, for which we had to pay him 50 francs each, I went back to my hotel, and there I saw the deadly thing in the basement. They asked me if I would go upstairs in the lift. From force of habit I risked it, and I held my breath all the way and clenched my hands. Nothing will induce me to try such a journey again. I would sooner go up to my room in a balloon. And why? Because if a balloon goes wrong you have a chance. It may spread out into a parachute after it has burst. It may catch in a tree. 101 things may happen. But if the lift falls down its shaft, you are done. As for seasickness, I shall never be sick again. I cannot tell you why, except that I know that it is so. In the shop in which I made this remarkable bargain, the shop to which none return when their business is done, I set out for it next day. Blindfolded, I could have found my way to the unfashionable quarter out of which a mean street runs, where you take the alley at the end, whence runs the cul-de-sac where the queer shop stood. A shop with pillars, fluted and painted red, stands on its near side. Its other neighbor is a low-class jeweler's with little silver brooches in the window. In such incongruous company stood the shop with beams, with its walls painted green. In half an hour I found the cul-de-sac, to which I had gone twice a day for the last week. I found the shop with the ugly painted pillars, and the jewelers that sold brooches, but the greenhouse with the 3 beams was gone. Pulled down, you will say, although in a single night. That can never be the answer to the mystery, for the house of the fluted pillars painted on plaster, and the low-class jeweler's shop with its silver brooches, all of which I could identify one by one, were standing side by side. End of The Bureau d'Échange de Meaux by Lord Dunsany. This recording by James Christopher.
In the Graveyard by Anton Chekhov. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. In the Graveyard by Anton Chekhov. The wind has got us up, friends, and it is beginning to get dark. Hadn't we better take ourselves off before it gets worse? The wind was frolicking among the yellow leaves of the old birch trees, and a shower of thick drops fell upon us from the leaves. One of our party slipped on the clayey soil, and clutched at a big grey cross to save himself from falling. Yegor Gryaz Narukov, titular councillor and cavalier, he read. I knew that gentleman. He was fond of his wife. He wore the Stanislav ribbon, and read nothing. His digestion worked well. Life was all right, wasn't it? One would have thought he had no reason to die. But alas, fate had its eye on him. The poor fellow fell a victim to his habits of observation. On one occasion, when he was listening at a keyhole, he got such a bang on the head from the door that he sustained concussion of the brain. He had a brain, and died. And here, under this tombstone, lies a man who from his cradle detested verses and epigrams. As though to mock him, his whole tombstone is adorned with verses. There's someone coming. A man in a shabby overcoat, with a shaven bluish-crimson countenance, overtook us. He had a bottle under his arm, and a parcel of sausage was sticking out of his pocket. "Where is the grave of Mushkin the actor?" he asked us in a husky voice. We conducted him towards the grave of Mushkin the actor, who had died 2 years before. "You are a government clerk, I suppose?" we asked him. "No, an actor. Nowadays it is difficult to distinguish actors from clerks of the consistory. No doubt you have noticed that. That's typical, but it's not very flattering for the government clerk." It was with difficulty that we found the actor's grave. It had sunken, was overgrown with weeds, and had lost all appearance of a grave. A cheap little cross that had begun to rot, and was covered with green moss blackened by the frost, had an air of aged dejection, and looked, as it were, ailing. "Forgotten friend Mushkin," we read. Time had erased the never, and corrected the falsehood of man. A subscription for a monument to him was got up among actors and journalists, but they drank up the money, the dear fellows, sighed the actor, bowing down to the ground and touching the wet earth with his knees and his cap. "How do you mean drank it?" "That's very simple. They collected the money, published a paragraph about it in the newspaper, and spent it on drink. I don't say it to blame them. I hope it did them good, dear things. Good health to them, and eternal memory to him." "Drinking means bad health, and eternal memory nothing but sadness. God give us remembrance for a time, but eternal memory, what next?" "You're right there. Mushkin was a well-known man, you see. There were a dozen wreaths on the coffin, and he is already forgotten. Those to whom he was dear have forgotten him, but those to whom he did harm remember him. I, for instance, shall never, never forget him, for I got nothing but harm from him. I have no love for the deceased."
What harm did he do you?"
"Great harm," sighed the actor, and an expression of bitter resentment overspread his face. "To me he was a villain and a scoundrel. The kingdom of heaven be his. It was through looking at him and listening to him that I became an actor. By his art he lured me from the paternal home. He enticed me with the excitements of an actor's life, promised me all sorts of things, and brought tears and sorrow. An actor's lot is a bitter one. I have lost youth, sobriety, and the divine semblance. I haven't a halfpenny to bless myself with. My shoes are down to the heels, my breeches are frayed and patched, and my face looks as if it had been gnawed by dogs. My head's full of free-thinking nonsense. He robbed me of my faith, my evil genius. It would have been something if I had talent, but as it is, I am ruined for nothing. It's cold, honored friends. Won't you have some? There is enough for all. Let us drink to the rest of his soul. Though I don't like him and though he's dead, he was the only one I had in the world. The only one. It's the last time I shall visit him. The doctors say I shall soon die of drink. So here I have come to say good-bye. One must forgive one's enemies.
We left the actor to converse with the dead Mushkin, and went on. It began drizzling a fine cold rain. At the turning into the principal avenue strewn with gravel, we met a funeral procession. 4 bearers, wearing white calico sashes and muddy high boots with leaves sticking on them, carried the brown coffin. It was getting dark, and they hastened, stumbling and shaking their burden. "We've only been walking here for a couple of hours, and that is the 3rd brought in already. Shall we go home, friends?"
End of In the Graveyard by Anton Chekhov. Read by Alan Davis Drake.
The King of the Polar Bears by L. Frank Baum. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The King of the Polar Bears by L. Frank Baum. Read by Amy Conger. The King of the Polar Bears lived among the icebergs in the far north country. He was old and monstrous big. He was wise and friendly to all who knew him. His body was thickly covered with long white hair that glistened like silver under the rays of the midnight sun. His claws were strong and sharp, that he might walk safely over the smooth ice, or grasp and tear the fishes and seals upon which he fed. The seals were afraid when he drew near and tried to avoid him, but the gulls, both white and gray, loved him because he left the remnants of his feasts for them to devour. Often his subjects, the polar bears, came to him for advice when ill or in trouble, but they wisely kept away from his hunting grounds, lest they might interfere with his sport and arouse his anger. The wolves, who sometimes came as far north as the icebergs, whispered among themselves that the king of the polar bears was either a magician or under the protection of a powerful fairy, for no earthly thing seemed able to harm him, and he never failed to secure plenty of food, and he grew bigger and stronger day by day and year by year. Yet the time came when this monarch of the north met man, and his wisdom failed him. He came out of his cave among the icebergs one day and saw a boat moving through the strip of water which had been uncovered by the shifting of the summer ice. In the boat were men. The great bear had never seen such creatures before, and therefore advanced toward the boat, sniffing the strange scent with aroused curiosity, and wondering whether he might take them for friends or foes, food or carrion. When the king came near the water's edge, a man stood up in the boat and with a queer instrument made a loud bang. The polar bear felt a shock. His brain became numb. His thoughts deserted him. His great limbs shook and gave way beneath him, and his body fell heavily upon the hard ice. That was all he remembered for a time. When he awoke, he was smarting with pain on every inch of his huge bulk, for the men had cut away his hide with its glorious white hair and carried it with them to a distant ship. Above him circled thousands of his friends the gulls, wondering if their benefactor were really dead and it was proper to eat him. But when they saw him raise his head and groan and tremble, they knew he still lived, and one of them said to his comrades, "The wolves were right. The king is a great magician, for even men cannot kill him, but he suffers for lack of covering. Let us repay his kindness to us by each giving him as many feathers as we can spare." This idea pleased the gulls. One after another they plucked with their beaks the softest feathers from under their wings, and flying down dropped them gently upon the body of the king of the polar bears. Then they called to him in a chorus, "Courage, friend! Our feathers are as soft and beautiful as your own shaggy hair. They will guard you from the cold winds and warm you while you sleep. Have courage, then, and live." And the king of the polar bears had courage to bear his pain, and lived, and was strong again. The feathers grew as they had grown upon the bodies of the birds, and covered him as his own hair had done. Mostly they were pure white in color, but some from the gray gulls gave his majesty a slightly mottled appearance. The rest of that summer, and all through the 6 months of night, the king left his icy cavern only to fish or catch seals for food. He felt no shame at his feathery covering, but it was still strange to him, and he avoided meeting any of his brother bears. During this period of retirement, he thought much of the men who had harmed him, and remembered the way that they had made the great bang, and he decided it was best to keep away from such fierce creatures. Thus he added to his store of wisdom. When the moon fell away from the sky, and the sun came to make the icebergs glitter with the gorgeous tintings of the rainbow, 2 of the polar bears arrived at the king's cavern to ask his advice about the hunting season. But when they saw his great body covered with feathers instead of hair, they began to laugh, and one said, "Our mighty king has become a bird. Who ever before heard of a feathered polar bear?" Then the king gave way to wrath. He advanced upon them with deep growls and stately tread, and with one blow of his monstrous paw stretched the mocker lifeless at his feet. The other ran away to his fellows and carried the news of the king's strange appearance. The result was a meeting of all the polar bears upon a broad field of ice, where they talked gravely of the remarkable change that had come upon their monarch. "He is, in reality, no longer a bear," said one, "nor can he justly be called a bird, but he is half bird and half bear, and so unfitted to remain our king." "Then who shall take his place?" asked another. "He who can fight the bird bear and overcome him," answered an aged member of the group. "Only the strongest is fit to rule our race." There was silence for a time, but at length a great bear moved to the front and said, "I will fight him. I, Wolf, the strongest of our race, and I will be king of the polar bears." The others nodded assent and dispatched a messenger to the king to say he must fight the great wolf and master him, or resign his sovereignty. For a bear with feathers, added the messenger, is no bear at all, and the king we obey must resemble the rest of us. I wear feathers because it pleases me, growled the king. Am I not a great magician? But I will fight, nevertheless, and if Woof masters me, he shall be king in my stead. Then he visited his friends the gulls, who were even then feasting upon the dead bear, and told them of the coming battle. I shall conquer, he said proudly, yet my people are in the right, for only a hairy one like themselves can hope to command their obedience. The queen gull said, I met an eagle yesterday which had made its escape from a big city of men, and the eagle told me that he had seen a monstrous polar bear skin thrown over the back of a carriage that rolled along the street. That skin must have been yours, O king, and if you wish, I will send 100 of my gulls to the city to bring it back to you. Let them go, said the king gruffly, and the 100 gulls were soon flying rapidly southward. For 3 days they flew straight as an arrow until they came to scattered houses, to villages and to cities. Then their search began. The gulls were brave and cunning and wise. Upon the 4th day they reached the great metropolis and hovered over the streets until a carriage rolled along with a great white bear robe thrown over the back seat. Then the birds swooped down, whole 100 of them, and seizing the skin in their beaks flew quickly away. They were late. The king's great battle was upon the 7th day, and they must fly swiftly to reach the polar regions by that time. Meanwhile, the bird bear was preparing for his fight. He sharpened his claws in the small crevasses of the ice. He caught a seal and tested his big yellow teeth by crunching its bones between them. And the queen gull set her band to pluming the king bear's feathers until they lay smoothly upon his body. But every day they cast anxious glances into the southern sky, watching for the 100 gulls to bring back the king's own skin. The 7th day came, and all the polar bears in that region gathered around the king's cavern. Among them was Woof, strong and confident of his success. The bird bear's feathers will fly fast enough when I get my claws upon him, he boasted, and the others laughed and encouraged him. The king was disappointed at not having recovered his skin, but he resolved to fight bravely without it. He advanced from the opening of his cavern with a proud and kingly bearing, and when he faced his enemy, he gave so terrible a growl that Woof's heart stopped beating for a moment, and he began to realize that a fight with the wise and mighty king of his race was no laughing matter. After exchanging 1 or 2 heavy blows with his foe, Woof's courage returned, and he determined to dishearten his adversary by bluster. "Come nearer, bird bear," he cried. "Come nearer that I may pluck your plumage." The defiance filled the king with rage. He ruffled his feathers as a bird does, till he appeared to be twice his actual size. Then he strode forward and struck Woof so powerful a blow that his skull cracked like an egg-shell, and he fell prone upon the ground. While the assembled bears stood looking with fear and wonder at their fallen champion, the sky became darkened. 100 gulls flew down from above and dropped upon the king's body a skin covered with pure white hair that glittered in the sun like silver. And behold, the bears saw before them the well-known form of their wise and respected master, and with one accord they bowed their shaggy heads in homage to the mighty king of the polar bears. This story teaches us that true dignity and courage depend not upon outward appearance, but come rather from within. Also that brag and bluster are poor weapons to carry into battle. End of The King of the Polar Bears.
Koosje, a study of Dutch life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Koosje, A Study of Dutch Life, by John Strange Winter. Her name was Koosje van Kampen, and she lived in Utrecht, that most quaint of quaint cities, the Venice of the North. All her life had been passed under the shadow of the grand old Dom Kerk. She had played bo peep behind the columns and arcades of the ruined, moss-grown cloisters, had slipped up and fallen down the steps leading to the grachts, had once or twice in this very early life been fished out of those same slimy, stagnant waters, had wandered under the great lindens in the Baan, and gazed curiously up at the stork's nest in the tree by the veterinary school, had pattered about the hollow-sounding streets in her noisy wooden klompen, had danced and laughed, had quarreled and wept, and fought and made friends again, to the tune of the silvery chimes high up in the Dom, chimes that were sometimes old Nederlandse hymns, sometimes Mendelssohn's melodies, and tender Lieder ohne Wort. But that was ever so long ago, and now she had left her romping childhood behind her, and had become a maid-servant, a very dignified and aristocratic maid-servant indeed, with no less a sum than £8 a year in wages. She lived in the house of a professor, who dwelt on the Münster Kerkhof, one of the most aristocratic parts of that wonderfully aristocratic city, and once or twice every week you might have seen her, if you had been there to see, busily engaged in washing the red tile and blue slate pathway in front of the professor's house. You would have seen that she was very pleasant to look at, this Koosje, very comely and clean, whether she happened to be very busy or whether it had been Sunday, and with her very best gown on, she was out for a promenade in the Baan, after duly going to service as regularly as the Sabbath dawned in the grand old Gothic choir of the cathedral. During the week she wore always the same costume as does every other servant in the country, a skirt of black stuff, short enough to show a pair of very neat-set and well-turned ankles, clad in cloth shoes, and knitted stockings that showed no wrinkles. Over the skirt a bodice and a kirtle of lilac, made with a neatly gathered frilling about her round brown throat. Above the frilling 5 or 6 rows of unpolished garnet beads fastened by a massive clip of gold filigree, and on her head a spotless white cap tied with a neat bow under her chin, as neat, let me tell you, as an Englishman's tie at a party. But it was on Sunday that Koosje shone forth in all the glory of a black gown and her jewelry, with great earrings to match the clasp of her necklace, and a heavy chain and cross to match that again, and 1 or 2 rings, while on her head she wore an immense cap, much too big to put a bonnet over, though for walking she was most particular to have gloves. Then, indeed, she was a young person to be treated with respect, and with respect she was undoubtedly treated. As she passed along the quaint, resounding streets, many a head was turned to look after her, but Koosje went on her way like the staid maiden she was, duly impressed with the fact that she was principal servant of Professor van Dyck, the most celebrated authority on the study of osteology in Europe. So Koosje never heeded the looks, turned her head neither to the right nor to the left, but went sedately on her business or pleasure, whichever it happened to be. It was not likely that such a treasure could remain long unnoticed and unsought after. Servants in the Netherlands, I hear, are not so good that they might be better, and most people knew what a treasure Professor van Dyck had in Koosje. However, as the professor conscientiously raised her wages from time to time, Koosje never thought of leaving him. But there is one bribe no woman can resist, the bribe that is offered by love. As Professor van Dyck had expected and feared, that bribe ere long was held out to Koosje, and Koosje was too weak to resist it. Not that he wished her to do so. If the girl had a chance of settling well and happily for life, he would be the last to dream of throwing any obstacle in her way. He had come to be an old man himself. He lived all alone, save for his servants, in a great rambling house, whose huge apartments were all set out with horrible anatomical preparations and grisly skeletons; and though the stately passages were paved with white marble, and led into rooms which would easily have accommodated crowds of guests, he went into no society save that of savants as old and fossil like as himself. In other words, he was an old bachelor who lived entirely for his profession and the study of the great masters by the interpretation of a genuine old Stradivari. Yet the old professor had a memory. He recalled the time when he had been young, who now was old, the time when his heart was a good deal more tender, his blood a great deal warmer, and his fancy very much more easily stirred than nowadays. There was a dead and gone romance which had broken his heart. Sentimentally speaking, a romance long since crumbled into dust, which had sent him for comfort into the study of osteology and the music of the Stradivari. Yet the memory thereof made him considerably more lenient to Koosje's weakness than Koosje herself had ever expected to find him. Not that she had intended to tell him at first. She was only 23, and though Jan van der Velde was as fine a fellow as could be seen in Utrecht, and had good wages and something put by, Koosje was by no means inclined to rush headlong into matrimony with undue hurry. It was more pleasant to live in the professor's good house, to have delightful walks arm in arm with Jan under the trees in the Baan, or around the signals, parting under the stars with many a lingering word and promise to meet again. It was during one of those very partings that the professor suddenly became aware, as he walked placidly home, of the change that had come into Koosje's life. However, Koosje told him blushingly that she did not wish to leave him just at present, so he did not trouble himself about the matter. He was a wise man, this old authority on osteology, and quoted oftentimes, "Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof." So the courtship sped smoothly on, seeming for once to contradict the truth of the old saying, "The course of true love never did run smooth." The course of their love did, of a truth, run marvellously smooth indeed. Koosje, if a trifle coy, was pleasant and sweet; Jan as fine a fellow as ever waited around a corner on a cold winter night. So brightly the happy days slipped by, when suddenly a change was effected in the professor's household, which made, as a matter of course, somewhat of a change in Koosje's life. It came about in this wise. Koosje had been on an errand for the professor, one that kept her out of doors some time, and it happened that night was bitterly cold. The cold, indeed, was fearful. The air had that damp rawness so noticeable in Dutch climate. A thick mist overhung the city, and a drizzling rain came down with a steady persistence, such as quickly soaked through the stoutest and thickest garments. The streets were well nigh empty. The great thoroughfare, the Oude Gracht, was almost deserted, and as Koosje hurried along Mijner Broederstraat, for she had a second commission there, she drew her great shawl more tightly round her, muttering crossly, "What weather! Yesterday so warm, to day so cold. 'Tis enough to give one the fever." She delivered her message and ran through the Oude Kerkhof as fast as her feet could carry her, when, just as she turned the corner into the Domplein, a fierce gust of wind, accompanied by a blinding shower of rain, assailed her. Her foot caught against something soft and heavy, and she fell. "Bless us!" she ejaculated blankly. "What fool has left a bundle on the path on such a night, pitch dark, with half the lamps out, and rain and mist enough to blind one?" She gathered herself up, rubbing elbows and knees vigorously, casting the while dark glances at the obnoxious bundle which had caused the disaster. Just then the wind was lulled. The lamp close at hand gave out a steady light, which shed its rays through the fog upon Koosje and the bundle, from which, to the girl's horror and dismay, came a faint moan. Quickly she drew nearer, when she perceived that what she had believed to be a bundle was indeed a woman, apparently in the last stage of exhaustion. Koosje tried to lift her, but the dead weight was beyond her, young and strong as she was. Then the rain and the wind came on again in fiercer gusts than before. The woman's moans grew louder and louder, and what to do Koosje knew not. She struggled on for the few steps that lay between her and the professor's house, and then she rang a peal which resounded through the echoing passages, bringing Dortje, the other maid, running out, after the manner of her class, imagining all sorts of terrible catastrophes had happened. She uttered a cry of relief when she perceived it was only Koosje, who, without vouchsafing any explanation, darted past her and ran straight into the professor's room. “Oh, professor!” she gasped out. But between her efforts to remove the woman, her struggle with the elements, and her race down the passage, her breath was utterly gone. The professor looked up from his book at his tea tray in surprise. For a moment he thought that Koosje, his domestic treasure, had altogether taken leave of her senses, for she was streaming with water, covered with mud, and head and cap were in a state of disorder, such as neither he nor any one else had ever seen them since the last time she had been fished out of the Nieuwe Gracht. “What is the matter, Koosje?” he asked, regarding her gravely over his spectacles. “There's a woman outside, dying,” she panted. “I fell over her.” “You had better try to get her in, then,” the old gentleman said, in quite a relieved tone. “You and Dortje must bring her in, dear poor soul; but it's a dreadful night.” The old gentleman shivered as he spoke, and drew a little nearer to the tall white porcelain stove. It was, as he had said a minute before, a terrible night. He could hear the wind beating about the house, and rattling about the casements, and moaning down the chimneys. And to think any poor soul should be out on such a night, dying! Heaven preserve others who might be belated or houseless in any part of the world! He fell into a fit of abstraction, a habit not uncommon with learned men, wondering why life should be so difficult with different people, why he should be in that warm, handsome room, with its soft rich hangings and carpet, with its beautiful furniture of carved wood, its pictures, and the rare china, scattered here and there among the grim array of skeletons which were his delight. He wondered why he should have his take of tea out of costly and valuable Oriental china, sugar and cream out of antique silver, while other poor souls had no tea at all, and nothing to take it out of, even if they had. He wondered why he should have a lamp under his teapot that was a very marvel of art transparencies, why he should have every luxury, and this poor creature should be dying in the street amid the wind and the rain. It was all very unequal. It was very odd, the professor argued, leaning his back against the tall warm stove. It was very odd indeed. He began to feel that, grand as the study of osteology undoubtedly is, he ought not to permit it to become so engrossing as to blind him to the study of the greater philosophies of life. His reverie was, however, broken by the abrupt re-entrance of Koosje, who this time was a trifle less breathless than she had been before. “We got her into the kitchen, professor,” she announced. “She is a child, a mere baby, and so pretty. She has opened her eyes and spoken.” “Give her some soup, and wine hot,” said the professor, without stirring. “But won't you come?” she asked. The professor hesitated. He hated attending in cases of illness, though he was a properly qualified doctor, and in an emergency would lay his prejudice aside. “Or shall I run across for the good Dr. Smit?” Koosje asked. “He would come in a minute, only it is such a night.” At that moment a fiercer gust than before rattled at the casements, and the professor laid aside his scruples. He followed his housekeeper down the chilly, marble-flagged passage into the kitchen, where he never went for months together. A cosy enough, pleasant place, with a deep valance hanging from the mantel-shelf, with great many copper pans, bright and shining as new gold, and furniture all scrubbed to the whiteness of snow. In an armchair before the open stove sat the rescued girl, a slight, golden-haired thing, with wistful blue eyes and a frightened air. Every moment she caught her breath in a half-hysterical sob, while violent shivers shook her from head to foot. The professor went and looked at her over his spectacles, as if she had been some curious specimen of his favorite study, but at the same time he kept at a respectable distance from her. “Give her some soup and wine,” he said at length, putting his hand under the tails of his long dressing gown of flowered cashmere. “Some soup and wine, hot, and put her to bed.” “Is she then to remain for the night?” Koosje asked, a little surprised. “Oh, don't send me away!” the golden-haired girl broke out, in a voice that was positively a wail, and clasping a pair of pretty, slender hands in piteous supplication. “Where do you come from?” the old gentleman asked, much as if he expected she might suddenly jump up and bite him. “From Beierland, mynheer,” she answered with a sob. “So, Koosje, she is remarkably well dressed, is she not?” the professor said, glancing at the costly lace headgear, the heavy gold headpiece, which lay on the table, together with the great gold spiral ornaments and filigree pendants, a dazzling head of richness. He looked, too, at the girl's white hands, at the rich crape-laden gown, at their delicate beauty and shower of waving gold hair, which, released from the confinement of its cap and headpiece, floated in a rich mass of glittering beauty over the pillows which his servant had placed beneath her head. The professor was old. The professor was wholly given up to his profession, which he jokingly called his sweetheart, and, though he cut half of his acquaintances in the street, through inattention and the shortness of his sight, he had eyes in his head, and upon occasion could use them. He therefore repeated the question. “Very well dressed indeed, professor,” returned Koosje, promptly. “And what are you doing in Utrecht in such a plight as this, too?” he asked, still keeping at a safe distance. “Oh, mynheer, I am all alone in the world,” she answered, her blue misty eyes filled with tears. “I had a month ago a dear, good, kind father, but he has died, and I am indeed desolate. I always believed him rich, and to these things,” with a gesture that included her dress and the ornaments on the table, “I have ever been accustomed. Thus I ordered without consideration such clothes as I thought needful, and then I found there was nothing for me, not 100 guilders to call my own when all was paid.” “But what brought you to Utrecht?” “He sent me here, mynheer. In his last illness, only of 3 days' duration, he bade me gather all together and come to this city, where I was to ask for a mevrouw Baake, his cousin.” “Mevrouw Baake, of the Sigarenfabriek?” said Dortje, in an aside to the others. “I lived servant with her before I came here.” “I had heard very little about her, only my father had sometimes mentioned his cousin to me. They had once been betrothed,” the stranger continued, “but when I reached Utrecht I found she was dead, 2 years dead, but we had never heard of it.” “Dear, dear, dear!” exclaimed the professor pityingly. “Well, you had better let Koosje put you to bed, and we will see what can be done for you in the morning.” “Am I to make up a bed?” Koosje asked, following him along the passage. The professor wheeled round and faced her. “She had better sleep in the guest room,” he said thoughtfully, regardless of the cold which struck to his slippered feet from the marble floor. “That is the only room which does not contain specimens that would probably frighten the poor child. I am very much afraid, Koosje,” he concluded doubtfully, “that she is a lady, and what we are to do with a lady I can't think.” With that the old gentleman shuffled off to his cosy room, and Koosje turned back to her kitchen. “He'll never think of marrying her,” mused Koosje, rather blankly. If she had spoken the thoughts to the professor himself, she would have received a very emphatic assurance of that, much as the study of osteology and the Stradivari had blinded him to the affairs of this workaday world, he was not yet so thoroughly foolish as to join his fossilized wisdom to the ignorance of a child of 16 or 17. However, on the morrow matters assumed a somewhat different aspect. Gertrude van Flute proved to be not exactly a gentlewoman. It is true that her father had been a well-to-do man for his station in life, and had very much spoiled and indulged his one motherless child. Yet her education was so slight that she could do little more than read and write, besides speaking a little English, which she had picked up from the yachtsmen frequenting her native town. The professor found that she had been but a distant relative of the Mevrouw Baake, to seek whom she had come to Utrecht, and that she had no kinsfolk upon whom she could depend, a fact which accounted for the profusion of her jewelry, all her golden trinkets having descended to her as heirlooms. "I can be your servant, mynheer," she suggested. "Indeed, I am a very useful girl, as you will find if you will but try me." Now, as a rule, the professor vigorously set his face against admitting young servants into his house. They broke his china, they disarrayed his bones, they meddled with his papers, and made general havoc. So in truth he was not very willing to have Gertrude Van Flute as a permanent member of his household, and he said so. But Koosje had taken a fancy to the girl, and having an eye to her own departure at no very distant date, for she had been betrothed more than 2 years, she pleaded so hard to keep her, promising to train her in all the professor's ways, to teach her the value of odd china and osteologic specimens, that eventually, with a good deal of grumbling, the old gentleman gave way, and, being a wise as well as an old gentleman, went back to his studies, dismissing Koosje and the girl alike from his thoughts. Just at first, Truide, poor child, was charmed. She put away her splendid ornaments, and some lilac frocks and black skirts were purchased for her. Her box, which she had left at the station, supplied all that was necessary for Sunday. It was great fun. For a whole week this young person danced about the rambling old house, playing at being a servant. Then she began to grow a little weary of it all. She had been accustomed, of course, to performing such offices as Dutch ladies fulfill, the care of china, of linen, the dusting of rooms, and the like, but she had done them as a mistress, not as an underling. And that was not the worst. It was when it came to her pretty feet having to be thrust into klompen, and her having to take a pail and syringe, and mop and clean the windows and the pathway and the front of the house, that the game of maid-servant began to assume a very different aspect. When, after having been as free as air to come and go as she chose, she was only permitted to attend service on Sundays, and to take an hour's promenade with Dortje, who was dull and heavy and stupid, she began to feel positively desperate, and the result of it all was that when Jan van der Velde came, as he was accustomed to do nearly every evening, to see Koosje, Miss Truide, from sheer longing for excitement and change, began to make eyes at him, with what effect I will endeavor to show. Just at first Koosje noticed nothing. She herself was of so faithful a nature that an idea, a suspicion of Jan's faithlessness, never entered her mind. When the girl laughed and blushed, and dimpled and smiled, when she cast her great blue eyes at the big young fellow, Koosje only thought how pretty she was, and how it was must a thousand pities she had not been born a great lady. And thus weeks slipped over. Never very demonstrative herself, Koosje saw nothing. Dortje, for her part, saw a great deal. But Dortje was a woman of few words, one who quite believed in the saying, "If speech is silver, silence is gold." So she held her peace. Now Truide, rendered fairly frantic by her enforced confinement to the house, grew to look upon Jan as her only chance of excitement and distraction. And Jan, poor thick-headed noodle of 6 feet high, was thoroughly wretched. What to do he knew not. A strange, mad, fierce passion for Truide had taken possession of him, and an utter distaste, almost dislike, had come in place of the old love for Koosje. Truide was unlike anything he had ever come in contact with before. She was so fairy-like, so light, so delicate, so dainty. Against Koosje's plumper, maturer charms, she appeared to the infatuated young man like, if he had ever heard of it he would probably have said, like a Dresden china image. But since he had not, he compared her in his own foolish heart to an angel. Her feet were so tiny, her hands so soft, her eyes so expressive, her waist so slim, her manner so bewitching. Somehow Koosje was altogether different. He could not endure the touch of her heavy hand, the tones of her less refined voice. He grew impatient at the denser perceptions of her mind. It was very foolish, very short-sighted. For the hands, though heavy, were clever and willing; the voice, though a trifle coarser in accent than Truide's childish tones, would never tell him a lie; the perceptions, though not brilliant, were the perceptions of good everyday common sense. It really was very foolish, for what charmed him most in Truide was the merest outside polish, a certain ease of manner which doubtless she had caught from the English aristocrats whom she had known in her native place. She had not half the sterling good qualities and steadfastness of Koosje, but Jan was in love, and did not stop to argue the matter as you or I are able to do. Men in love, very wise and great men too, are often like Jan van der Velde. They lay aside, pro tem, the whole amount, be it great or small, of wisdom they possess. And it must be remembered that Jan van der Velde was neither a wise nor a great man. Well, in the end there came what the French call un denouement, what we in forcible modern English would call a smash. And it happened thus. One evening toward the summer that Koosje's eyes were suddenly opened, and she became aware of the free and easy familiarity of Truide's manner towards her betrothed lover Jan. It was some very slight and trivial thing that led her to notice it, but in an instant the whole truth flashed across her mind. “Leave the kitchen,” she said, in a tone of authority. But it happened that, at the very instant she spoke, Jan was furtively holding Truide's fingers under the cover of the tablecloth, and when, on hearing the sharp words, the girl would have snatched them away, he, with true masculine instinct of opposition, held them fast. “What do you mean by speaking to her like that?” he demanded, an angry flush overspreading his dark face. “What is the maid to you?” Koosje asked, indignantly. “Maybe more than you are,” he retorted, in answer to which Koosje deliberately marched out of the kitchen, leaving them alone. To say she was indignant would be but very mildly to express the state of her feelings. She was furious. She knew that the end of her romance had come. No thoughts of making friends with Jan entered her mind. Only a great storm filled her heart till it was ready to burst with pain and anguish. As she went along the passage the professor's bell sounded, and Koosje, being close to the door, went abruptly in. The professor looked up in mild astonishment, quickly enough changed to dismay as he caught the sight of his valued Koosje's face, from out of which anger seemed in a moment to have thrust all the bright, comely beauty. “How now, my good Koosje?” said the old gentleman. “Is aught amiss?” “Yes, professor, there is,” returned Koosje, all in a blaze of anger, and moving as she spoke, the tea-tray, which she set down upon the oaken buffet with a bang which made its fair and delicate freight fairly jingle again. “But you needn't break my china, Koosje,” suggested the old gentleman, mildly, arising from his chair and getting into his favourite attitude before the stove. “You're quite right, professor,” returned Koosje, curtly. She was sensible even in her trouble. “And what is the trouble?” he asked, gently. “It's just this, professor,” cried Koosje, setting her arms akimbo, and speaking in a high-pitched, shrill voice. “You and I have been warming a viper in our bosoms, and viper-like she has turned around and bitten me.” “Is it Truide?” “Truide!” she affirmed, disdainfully. “Yes, it is Truide, for who but me would be dead now of hunger and cold or worse? And she has been making love to that great fool Jan van der Velde, great oaf that he is, after all I have done for her, after my dragging her in out of the cold and rain, after all I have taught her. Ah, professor, but it is a vile, venomous viper that we have been warming in our bosoms.” “I must beg, Koosje,” said the old gentleman, sedately, “that you will exonerate me from any such proceedings. If you remember rightly, I was altogether against your plan for keeping her in the house.” He could not resist giving her that little dig, kind of heart as he was. “Serves me right for being so soft-hearted,” thundered Koosje. “I will be wiser next time I fall over a bundle and leave it where I find it.” “No, no, Koosje, don't say that,” the old gentleman remonstrated, gently. “After all, it may be but a blessing in disguise. God sends all our trials for some good and wise purpose. Our heavy afflictions are often, nay, most times, Koosje, means to some great end, which, while the cloud of adversity hangs over us, we are unable to discern." "Ah!" sniffed Koosje, scornfully. "This oaf, as I must say you justly term him, for you are a good clever woman, Koosje, as I can testify after the experience of years, has proved that he can be false. He has shown that he can throw away substance for shadow, for of a truth that poor pretty child would make a sad wife for a poor man. Yet it is better you should know it now than at some future date, when there might be other ties to make the knowledge more bitter to you." "Yes, that is true," said Koosje, passing the back of her hand across her trembling lips. She could not shed tears over her trouble. Her eyes were dry and burning, as if anger had scorched the blessed drops up ere they should fall. She went on washing the cups and saucers, or at least the cup and saucer, and other articles the professor had used for his tea, and after a few minutes' silence he spoke again. "What are you going to do? Punish her, or turn her out, or what?" "I shall let him marry her," replied Koosje, with a pretentious nod. The old gentleman couldn't help laughing. "You think he will pay off your old scores?" "Before long," answered Koosje, grimly. "She will find him out, as I have done." Then, having finished washing the tea things, which the professor had shuddered to behold in her angry hands, she whirled herself out of the room and left him alone. "Oh, these women!" he cried, in confidence, to the pictures and skeletons. "What a worry they are! An old bachelor has the best of it, in the main, I do believe. But oh, Jan van der Velde, what a donkey you must be to get yourself mixed up in such a broil! And yet, ah!" The fossilized old gentleman broke off with a sigh as he recalled the memory of a certain dead and gone romance which had happened, goodness only knows how many years before, when he, like Jan van der Velde, would have thrown the world away for a glance of a certain pair of blue eyes, at the biting of a certain English tongue, whose broken Nederlandse taal was to him the sweetest music ever heard on earth, sweeter even than the strains of the Stradivari, when from under his skilful fingers rose the perfect melodies of old masters. Ay, but the sweet eyes had been closed in death many a long year, the sweet voice hushed in silence. He had watched the dear life ebb away, the fire in the blue eyes fade out. He had felt each day that the clasp of the little greeting fingers was less close. Each day he had seen the outline of the face grow sharper. And at last there had come one when the poor little Englishwoman met him with the gaze of one who knew him not, and babbled, not of green fields, but of horses and dogs, and of a brother Jack who 5 years before had gone down with Her Majesty's ship Alligator in mid Atlantic. Ay, but that was many and many a year agone. His young, blue-eyed love stood out alone in life's history, a thing apart, of the gentler sex. In a general way, the old professor had not seen that which had raised it in his estimation to the level of the one woman over whose memory hung a bright halo of romance. 15 years had passed away. The old professor of osteology had passed away with them, and in the large house on the Domplein lived a baron, with a half-dozen noisy, happy, healthy children, young Fraulas and Jonkheers, who scampered up and down the marble passages, and fell headlong down the steep, narrow, unlighted stairways, to the imminent danger of dislocating their aristocratic little necks. There was a new race of neat maids, clad in the same neat livery of lilac and black, who scoured and cleaned just as Koosje and Dortje had done in the old professor's day. You might indeed have heard the selfsame names resounding through the echoing rooms: Koosje, Dortje. But the Koosje and Dortje were not the same. What had become of Dortje I cannot say, but on the left-hand side of the busy, bustling, picturesque Oude Gracht there was a handsome shop filled with all manner of cakes, sweeties, confections, and liqueurs, from absinthe to Benedictine, or arrack to chartreuse. In that shop was a handsome, prosperous, middle-aged woman, well-dressed and well-mannered, no longer Professor Van Dijk's Koosje, but the Jevrouw van Kampen. Yes, Koosje had come to be a prosperous tradeswoman of good position, respected by all. But she was Koosje van Kampen still. The romance which had come to so disastrous and abrupt an end had sufficed for her life. Many an offer had been made to her, it is true, but she had always declared that she had had enough of lovers. She had found out their real value. I must tell you that at the time of Jan's infidelity, after the first flush of rage was over, Koosje disdained to show any sign of grief or regret. She was very proud, this Netherland servant maid, far too proud to let those by whom she was surrounded imagine she was wearing the willow for the faithless Jan, and when Dortje, on the day of the wedding, remarked that for her part she had always considered Koosje remarkably cool on the subject of matrimony, Koosje, with a careless outturning of her hands, palms uppermost, answered that she was right. Very soon after their marriage, Jan and his young wife left Utrecht for Arnhem, where Jan had promise of higher wages, and thus they passed, as Koosje thought, completely out of her life. “I don't wish to hear any more about them, if you please,” she said, severely and emphatically to Dortje. But not so. In time the professor died, leaving Koosje the large legacy with which she set up the handsome shop in the Oude Gracht, and several years passed on. It happened one day that Koosje was sitting in her shop sewing. In the large inner room a party of ladies and officers were eating cakes and drinking chocolates and liqueurs with a good deal of fun and laughter, when the door opened timidly, thereby letting in a gust of bitter wind, and a woman crept fearfully in, followed by two small crying children. Could the lady give her something to eat, she asked. They had had nothing during the day, and the little ones were almost famished. Koosje, who was very charitable, lifted a tray of large plain buns, and was about to give her some when her eyes fell upon the poor beggar's faded face, and she exclaimed, “Truide?” Truide, for it was she, looked up in startled surprise. “I did not know, or I would not have come in, Koosje,” she said, humbly, “for I treated you badly.” “Very badly,” returned Koosje, emphatically. “Then where is Jan?” “Dead,” murmured Truide, sadly. “Dead? So! Ah, well, I suppose I must do something for you. Here, Jankje.” Opening the door, she called, “Jankje!” “Ja, jevrouw,” a voice cried in reply. The next moment a maid came running into the shop. “Take these people into the kitchen and give them something to eat. Put them by the stove while you prepare it. There is some soup, and that smoked ham we had for koffie. Then come here and take my place for a while.” “Ja, jevrouw,” said Jankje, disappearing again, followed by Truide and her children. Then Koosje sat down again and began to think. “I said,” she mused presently, “that night that the next time I fell over a bundle I'd leave it where I found it. Ah, well, I'm not a barbarian. I couldn't do that. I never thought, though, it would be Truide.” “Hi, jevrouw,” was called from the inner room. “Ja, meneer,” jumping up and going to her customers. She attended to their wants, and presently bowed them out. “I never thought it would be Truide,” she repeated to herself, as she closed the door behind the last of the gay uniforms and jingling scabbards. “And Jan is dead. Ah, well!” Then she went into the kitchen, where the miserable children, girls both of them, and pretty, had they been clean and less forlornly clad, were playing about the stove. “So Jan is dead,” began Koosje, seating herself. “Yes, Jan is dead,” Truide answered. “And he left you nothing?” Koosje asked. “We had had nothing for a long time,” Truide replied in her sad, crushed voice. “We didn't get on very well. He soon got tired of me.” “That was a weakness of his,” remarked Koosje, dryly. “We lost 5 little ones, one after another,” Truide continued, “and Jan was fond of them, and sometimes it seemed to sour him. As for me, I was sorry enough at the time, heaven knows, but it was as well. But Jan said it seemed as if a curse had fallen upon us. He began to wish you back again, and to blame me for having come between you. And then he took to Geneviève, and then to wish for something stronger. So at last every stiver went for abstinence. And once or twice he beat me, and then he died.” “Just as well,” muttered Koosje under her breath. “It is very good of you to have fed and warmed us. Truide went on in her faint, complaining tones. "Many a one would have let me starve, and I should have deserved it. It was very good of you, and we are grateful. But 'tis time we're going. Koosje and Mina," then added, with a shake of her head, "but I don't know where." "Oh, you'd better stay," said Koosje, hurriedly. "I live in this big house all by myself, and I dare say you'll be more useful in the shop than Yanke. If your tongue is as glib as it used to be, that is. You know some English, too, don't you?" "A little," Truide answered, eagerly. "And after all," Koosje said, philosophically, shrugging her shoulders, "you saved me from the beatings and the starvings and the rest. I owe you something for that. Why, if it hadn't been for you, I should have been silly enough to have married him." And then she went back to her shop, saying to herself, "The professor said it was a blessing in disguise. God sends all our trials to work some great purpose. Yes, that was what he said, and he knew most things. Just think if I were trailing about now with those two little ones, with nothing to look back to but a schnapps drinking husband who beat me. Ah, well, well, things are best as they are. I don't know that I ought not to be very much obliged to her, and she'll be very useful in the shop." End of Koosje, a study of Dutch life.
Love by Anton Chekhov. Read for LibriVox.org by Alan Davis Drake. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Love by Anton Chekhov. 3 o'clock in the morning. The soft April light is looking in at my window and caressingly winking at me with its stars. I can't sleep. I am so happy. My whole being from head to heels is bursting with a strange, incomprehensible feeling. I can't analyze it just now. I haven't the time. I'm too lazy. And hang analysis. Why is a man likely to interpret his sensations when he is flying head foremost from a belfry, or has just learned that he has won 200,000? Is he in a state to do it? This was more or less how I began my love letter to Sasha, a girl of 19 with whom I had fallen in love. I began it 5 times, and as often tore up the sheets, scratched out whole pages, and copied it all over again. I spent as long over the letter as if it had been a novel I had to write to order, and it was not because I tried to make it longer, more elaborate, or more fervent, but because I wanted endlessly to prolong the process of this writing. When one sits in the stillness of one's study and communes with one's own daydreams, while the spring night looks in at one's window. Between the lines I saw a beloved image, and it seemed to me that there were, sitting at the same table writing with me, spirits as naively happy, as foolish, and as blissfully smiling as I. I wrote continually, looking at my hand, which still ached deliciously where hers had lately pressed it. And if I turned my eyes away, I had a vision of the green trellis of the little gate. Through that trellis Sasha gazed at me after I had said good-bye to her. When I was saying good-bye to Sasha, I was thinking of nothing, and was simply admiring her figure as every decent man admires a pretty woman. When I saw through the trellis 2 big eyes, I suddenly, as though by inspiration, knew that I was in love, that it was all settled between us, and fully decided already that I had nothing left to do but to carry out certain formalities. It is a great delight also to seal up a love letter, and slowly putting on one's hat and coat, go softly out of the house and to carry the treasure to the post. There are no stars in the sky now. In their place there is a long whitish streak to the east, broken here and there by clouds above the roofs of the dingy houses. From that streak the whole sky is flooded with pale light. The town is asleep, but already the water carts have come out, and somewhere in a far-away factory a whistle sounds to wake up the workpeople. Besides the post-box, slightly moist with dew, you are sure to see the clumsy figure of a house-porter, wearing a bell-shaped sheepskin and carrying a stick. He is in a condition akin to catalepsy. He is not asleep or awake, but something in between. If the boxes knew how often people resort to them for the decision of their fate, they would not have such a humble air. I, anyway, almost kissed my post-box, and as I gazed at it I reflected that the post is the greatest of blessings. I beg anyone who has ever been in love to remember how one usually hurries home after dropping the letter in the box, rapidly gets into bed, and pulls up the quilt in the full conviction that as soon as one wakes up in the morning one will be overwhelmed with memories of the previous day, and look with rapture at the window, where the daylight will be eagerly making its way through the folds of the curtain. Well, to facts. Next morning, at midday, Sasha's maid brought me the following answer. I am delighted. Be sure to come to us today. Please, I shall expect you. Your S. Not a single comma. This lack of punctuation and the misspelling of the word delighted, the whole letter, and even the long, narrow envelope in which it was put, filled my heart with tenderness. In the sprawling but diffident handwriting I recognized Sasha's walk, her way of raising her eyebrow when she laughed, the movement of her lips. But the contents of the letter did not satisfy me. In the first place, poetical letters are not answered in that way, and, in the second, why should I go to Sasha's house to wait till it should occur to her stout mamma, her brothers, and her poor relations to leave us alone together? It would never enter their heads. And nothing is more hateful than to have to restrain one's raptures simply because of the intrusion of some animate trumpery in the shape of a half-deaf old woman or little girl pestering one with questions. I sent an answer by the maid, asking Sasha to select some park or boulevard for a rendezvous. My suggestion was readily accepted. I had struck the right chord, as the saying is. Between 4 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon I made my way to the furthest and most overgrown part of the park. There was not a soul in the park, and the tryst might have taken place somewhere nearer in one of the avenues or arbours, but the women don't like doing it by halves in romantic affairs. In for a penny, in for a pound. If you're in for a tryst, let it be the furthest and most impenetrable thicket, where one runs the risk of stumbling upon some rough or drunken man. When I went up to Sasha, she was standing with her back to me, and in that back I could read a devilish lot of mystery. It seemed as though that back and the nape of her neck and the black spots on her dress were saying, "Hush!" The girl was wearing a simple cotton dress over which she had thrown a light cape. To add to the air of mysterious secrecy, her face was covered with a white veil. Not to spoil the effect, I had to approach on tiptoe and speak in a half-whisper. From what I remember now, I was not so much the essential point of the rendezvous as a detail of it. Sasha was not so much absorbed in the interview herself as in its romantic mysteriousness. My kisses, the silence of the gloomy tree, my vows. There was not a minute in which she forgot herself, was overcome, or let the mysterious expression drop from her face. And really, if there had been any Ivan Sidoritch or Sidor Ivanitch in my place, she would have felt just as happy. How is one to make out in such circumstances whether one is loved or not, whether the love is the real thing or not. From the park I took Sasha home with me. The presence of the beloved woman in one's bachelor quarters affects one like wine and music. Usually one begins to speak of the future, and the confidence and self-reliance with which one does is beyond bounds. You make plans and projects, talk fervently of the rank of general, though you have not yet reached the rank of a lieutenant, and altogether you fire off such high-flown nonsense that your listener must have a great deal of love and ignorance of life to assent to it. Fortunately for men, women in love are always blinded by their feelings and never know anything of life. Far from not assenting, they actually turn pale with holy awe, are full of reverence, and hang greedily on the maniac's words. Sasha listened to me with attention, but I soon detected an absent-minded expression on her face. She did not understand me. The future of which I talked interested her only in its external aspect, and I was wasting time in displaying my plans and projects before her. She was keenly interested in knowing which would be her room, what papers she would have in her room, why I had an upright piano instead of a grand piano, and so on. She examined carefully all the little things on my table, looked at the photographs, sniffed at the bottles, peeled the old stamps off the envelopes, saying she wanted them for something. "Please collect old stamps for me," she said, making a grave face. "Please do." Then she found a nut in the window, noisily cracked it, and ate it. "Why don't you stick little labels on the backs of your books?" she asked, taking a look at the bookcase. "What for?" "Oh, so that each book should have its number. And where am I to put my books? I've got books too, you know." "What books have you got?" I asked. Sasha raised her eyebrows, thought a moment, and said, "All sorts." And if it had entered my head to ask her what thoughts, what convictions, what aims she had, she would no doubt have raised her eyebrows, thought a minute, and have said it all the same way, "All sorts." Later I saw Sasha home and left her house regularly, officially engaged, and was so reckoned till our wedding. If the reader will allow me to judge merely from my personal experience, I maintain that to be engaged is very dreary, far more than to be a husband or nothing at all. An engaged man is neither one nor the other. He has left one side of the river and not yet reached the other. He is not married, and yet he can't be said to be a bachelor, but is in something not unlike the condition of the porter whom I have mentioned above. Every day, as soon as I had a free moment, I hastened to my fiancée. As I went, I usually bore with me a multitude of hopes, desires, intentions, suggestions, phrases. I always fancied that as soon as the maid opened the door I should, from feeling oppressed and stifled, plunge at once up to my neck into a sea of refreshing happiness. But it always turned out otherwise, in fact. Every time I went to see my fiancée, I found all her family and other members of the household busy over the silly trousseau. And by the way, they were hard at work sewing for 2 months, and then they had less than 100 roubles worth of things. There was a smell of irons, candle grease, and fumes. Bugles crunched under one's feet. The 2 most important rooms were piled up with billows of linen, calico, and muslin, and from among the billows peeped out Sasha's little head, with a thread between her teeth. All the sewing party welcomed me with cries of delight, but at once led me off into the dining-room, where I could not hinder them nor see what only husbands are permitted to behold. In spite of my feelings, I had to sit in the dining-room and converse with Pimenova, one of the poor relations. Sasha looked worried and excited, kept running by me with a thimble, a skein of wool, or some other boring object. "Wait, wait, I shan't be a minute," she would say when I raised imploring eyes to her. "Only fancy, that wretch Stepanida has spoilt the bodice of the barège dress." And after waiting in vain for this grace, I lost my temper, went out the house, and walked about the streets in the company of the new cane I had bought. Or I would want to go for a walk or a drive with my fiancée, would go round and find her already standing in the hall with her mother, dressed to go out, and playing with her parasol. "Oh, we are going to the Arcade," she would say. "We have got to buy some more cashmere and change the hat." My outing is knocked on the head. I join the ladies and go with them to the Arcade. It is revoltingly dull to listen to women shopping, haggling and trying to outdo the sharp shopmen. I felt ashamed when Sasha, after turning over masses of material and knocking down the prices to a minimum, walked out of the shop without buying anything, or else told the shopman to cut her some half-roubles worth. When they came out of the shop, Sasha and her mamma, with scared and worried faces, would discuss at length having made a mistake, having bought the wrong thing, the flowers and the chins being too dark, and so on. Yes, it is a bore to be engaged. I'm glad it's over. Now I am married. It is evening. I am sitting in my study reading. Behind me on the sofa Sasha is sitting munching something noisily. I want a glass of beer. "Sasha, look for the corkscrew," I say. "It's lying about somewhere." Sasha leaps up, rummages in a disorderly way among 2 or 3 heaps of papers, drops the matches, and without finding the corkscrew sits down in silence. 5 minutes pass. 10. I begin to be fretted both by thirst and vexation. "Sasha, do look for the corkscrew," I say. Sasha leaps up again, rummages among the papers near me. Her munching and rustling of the papers affects me like the sound of sharpening knives against each other. I get up and begin looking for the corkscrew myself. At last it is found, and the beer is uncorked. Sasha remains by the table and begins telling me something at great length. "You'd better read something, Sasha," I say. She takes up a book, sits down facing me, and begins moving her lips. I look at her little forehead, moving lips, and sink into thought. She is getting on for 20, I reflect. If one takes a boy of the educated class and of that age and compares them, what a difference! The boy would have knowledge and convictions, and some intelligence. But I forgive that difference just as the low forehead and moving lips are forgiven. I remember in my old Lovelace days I had cast off woman for a stain on their stockings, and for one foolish word, or for not cleaning their teeth. And now I forgive everything, the munching, the muddling about after the corkscrew, the slovenliness, the long talking about nothing that matters. I forgive it all, almost unconsciously, with no effort of will, as though Sasha's mistakes were my mistakes, and many things which would have made me wince in old days move me to tenderness and even rapture. The explanation of this forgiveness of everything lies in my love for Sasha. But what is the explanation of the love itself? I really don't know.
End of Love by Anton Chekhov. This recording is in the public domain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Story Without a Title by Anton Chekhov. Read for LibriVox.org by Alan Davis Drake. In the 5th century, just as now, the sun rose every morning, and every evening retired to rest. In the morning, when the first rays kissed the dew, the earth revived. The air was filled with the sounds of rapture and hope, while in the evening the same earth subsided into silence and plunged into gloomy darkness. One day was like another, one night like another. From time to time a storm cloud raced up, and there was the angry rumble of thunder, or a negligent star fell out of the sky, or a pale monk ran to tell the brotherhood that not far from the monastery he had seen a tiger. The monks worked and prayed, and their Father Superior played on the organ, made Latin verses, and wrote music. The wonderful old man possessed an extraordinary gift. He played on the organ with such art that even the oldest monks, whose hearing had grown somewhat dull towards the end of their lives, could not restrain their tears when the sounds of the organ floated from his cell. When he spoke of anything, even the most ordinary things, for instance, of the trees, of the wild beasts, or of the sea, they would not listen to him without a smile or tears, and it seemed that the same chords vibrated in his soul as in the organ. His face flushed, and his voice thundered, and as the monks listened to him, they felt that their souls were spellbound from his inspiration. At such marvelous, splendid moments, his power over them was boundless, and if he had bidden his elders fling themselves into the sea, they would all, every one of them, have hastened to carry out his wishes. His music, his voice, his poetry, in which he glorified God, the heavens, and the earth, were a continual source of joy to the monks. It sometimes happened that through the monotony of their lives they grew weary of the trees, the flowers, the spring, the autumn. Their ears were tired of the sound of the sea, and the song of the birds seemed tedious to them. But the talents of their Father Superior were as necessary to them as their daily bread. Dozens of years passed by, and every day was like every other day, every night was like every other night. Except the birds and the wild beasts, not one soul appeared near the monastery. The nearest human habitation was far away, and to reach it from the monastery, or to reach the monastery from it, meant a journey of over 70 miles across the desert. Only men who despised life, who had renounced it, and who came to the monastery as to the grave, ventured to cross the desert. What was the amazement of the monks, therefore, when one night there knocked at their gate a man who turned out to be from the town, and the most ordinary sinner who loved life. Before saying his prayers and asking for the Father Superior's blessing, this man asked for wine and food. To the question how he had come from the town into the desert, he answered by a long story of hunting. He had gone out hunting and had drunk too much and lost his way. To the suggestion that he should enter the monastery and save his soul, he replied with a smile, "I am not a fit companion for you." When he had eaten and drunk, he looked at the monks who had served him, shook his head reproachfully, and said, "You don't do anything, you monks. You are good for nothing but eating and drinking. Is that the way to save one's soul? Only think, while you sit here in peace, eat and drink and dream of beatitude, your neighbors are perishing and going to hell. You should see what is going on in the town. Some are dying of hunger, Others, not knowing what to do with their gold, sink into profligacy and perish like flies struck in honey. There is no faith, no truth in men. Whose task is it to save them? Whose work is to preach to them? It is not for me, drunk from morning till night as I am. Can a meek spirit, a loving heart, and faith in God have been given you for you to sit here within four walls doing nothing? The townsman's drunken words were insolent and unseemly, but they had a strange effect upon the Father Superior. The old man exchanged glances with the monks, turned pale, and said, "My brothers, he speaks the truth, you know. Indeed, poor people in their weakness and lack of understanding are perishing in vice and infidelity, while we do not move, as though it did not concern us. Why should I not go and remind them of the Christ whom they have forgotten?" The townsman's words had carried the old man away. The next day he took his staff, said farewell to the brotherhood, and set off for the town. And the monks were left without music, without his speeches and verses. They spent a month drearily, then a second, but the old man did not come back. At last, after 3 months had passed, the familiar tap of his staff was heard. The monks flew to meet him and showered questions upon him. But instead of being delighted to see them, he wept bitterly and did not utter a word. The monks noticed that he looked greatly aged and had grown thinner. His face looked exhausted and wore an expression of profound sadness, and when he wept, he had the air of a man who had been outraged. The monks fell into weeping too, and began with sympathy asking him why he was weeping, why his face was so gloomy. But he locked himself in his cell without uttering a word. For 7 days he sat in his cell, eating and drinking nothing, weeping and not playing on his organ. To knocking at his door and the entreaties of the monks to come out and share his grief with them, he replied with unbroken silence. At last he came out, gathering all the monks around him, with a tear-stained face and with an expression of grief and indignation. He began telling them of what had befallen him during those 3 months. His voice was calm, and his eyes were smiling when he described his journey from the monastery to the town. On the road, he told them, the birds sang to him, the brooks gurgled, and sweet youthful hopes agitated his soul. He marched on and felt like a soldier going to battle, and confident of victory. He walked on dreaming, and composed poems and hymns, and reached the end of his journey without noticing it. But his voice quivered, his eyes flashed, and he was full of wrath when he came to speak of the town and of the men in it. Never in his life had he seen or even dared to imagine what he met with when he went into the town. Only then, for the first time in his life, in his old age, he saw and understood how powerful was the devil, how fair was the evil, and how weak and faint-hearted and worthless were men. By an unhappy chance, the first dwelling he entered was the abode of vice. Some 50 men in possession of much money were eating and drinking wine beyond measure. Intoxicated by the wine, they sang songs and boldly uttered terrible, revolting words such as a God-fearing man could not bring himself to pronounce. Boundlessly free, self-confident and happy, they feared neither God nor the devil, nor death, but said and did what they liked, and went whither their lust led them. And the wine, clear as amber, flecked with sparks of gold, must have been irresistibly sweet and fragrant, for each man who drank it smiled blissfully and wanted to drink more. To the smile of man, it responded with a smile, and sparkled joyfully when they drank it, as though it knew the devilish charm it kept hidden in its sweetness. The old man, growing more and more incensed and weeping with wrath, went on to describe what he had seen. On a table in the midst of the revellers, he said, stood a sinful, half-naked woman. It was hard to imagine, or to find in nature anything more lovely and fascinating. This reptile, young, long-haired, dark-skinned, with black eyes and full lips, shameless and insolent, showed her snow-white teeth and smiled as though to say, "Look how shameless, how beautiful I am." Silken brocade fell in lovely folds from her shoulders, but her beauty would not hide itself under her clothes, but eagerly thrust itself through the folds, like the young grass through the ground in spring. The shameless woman drank wine, sang songs, and abandoned herself to anyone who wanted her. Then the old man, wrathfully brandishing his arms, described the horse races, the bullfights, the theaters, the artists' studios where they painted naked women or modeled them of clay. He spoke with inspiration, with sonorous beauty, as though he were playing on unseen chords, while the monks, petrified, greedily drank in his words and gasped with rapture. After describing all the charms of the devil, the beauty of evil, and the fascinating grace of the dreadful female form, the old man cursed the devil, turned and shut himself up in his cell. When he came out of his cell in the morning, there was not a monk left in the monastery. They had all fled to the town. End of A Story Without a Title. This recording is in the public domain.
The Beauties by Anton Chekhov. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Will Larson, Berkeley, California. The Beauties by Anton Chekhov. Translation by Constance Garnett. 1. I remember, when I was a high school boy in the 5th or 6th class, I was driving with my grandfather from the village of Bolshoye Kryepkoye in the Don region to Rostov-on-the-Don. It was a sultry, languidly dreary day of August. Our eyes were glued together, and our mouths were parched from the heat and the dry, burning wind which drove clouds of dust to meet us. One did not want to look or speak or think, and when our drowsy driver, a little Russian called Karpo, swung his whip at the horses and lashed me on my cap, I did not protest or utter a sound, but only, rousing myself from half-slumber, gazed mildly and dejectedly into the distance to see whether there was a village visible through the dust. We stopped to feed the horses in a big Armenian village at a rich Armenian's whom my grandfather knew. Never in my life have I seen a greater caricature than that Armenian. Imagine a little shaven head with thick overhanging eyebrows, a beak of a nose, long gray mustaches, and a wide mouth with a long cherry-wood chibouk sticking out of it. This little head was clumsily attached to a lean, hunchback carcass, attired in a fantastic garb, a short red jacket and full bright blue trousers. This figure walked, straddling its legs and shuffling with its slippers, spoke without taking the chibouk out of its mouth, and behaved with truly Armenian dignity, not smiling, but staring with wide open eyes, and trying to take as little notice as possible of its guests. There was neither wind nor dust in the Armenian's rooms, but it was just as unpleasant, stifling and dreary as in the steppe and on the road. I remember, dusty and exhausted by the heat, I sat in the corner on a green box. The unpainted wooden walls, the furniture, and the floors, colored with yellow ochre, smelt of dry wood baked by the sun. Wherever I looked there were flies and flies and flies. Grandfather and the Armenian were talking about grazing, about manure, and about oats. I knew that they would be a good hour getting his samovar, that grandfather would be not less than an hour drinking his tea, and then would lie down to sleep for 2 or 3 hours, that I should waste a quarter of the day waiting, after which there would be again the heat, the dust, the jolting cart. I heard the muttering of the 2 voices, and it began to seem to me that I had been seeing the Armenian, the cupboard with the crockery, the flies, the windows with the burning sun beating on them for ages and ages, and should only cease to see them in the far-off future, and I was seized with hatred for the steppe, the sun, the flies. A little Russian peasant woman in a kerchief brought in a tray of tea things, then the samovar. The Armenian went slowly out into the passage and shouted, "Masha, come and pour out tea. Where are you, Masha?" Hurried footsteps were heard, and there came into the room a girl of 16 in a simple cotton dress and a white kerchief. As she washed the crockery and poured out the tea, she was standing with her back to me, and all I could see was that she was of a slender figure, barefooted, and that her little bare heels were covered by long trousers. The Armenian invited me to have tea. Sitting down to the table, I glanced at the girl who was handing me a glass of tea, and felt all at once as though a wind were blowing over my soul, and blowing away all the impressions of the day with their dust and dreariness. I saw the bewitching features of the most beautiful face I have ever met in real life or in my dreams. Before me stood a beauty, and I recognized that, at the first glance, as I should have recognized lightning. I am ready to swear that Masha, or as her father called her, Mashya, was a real beauty, but I don't know how to prove it. It sometimes happens that clouds are huddled together in disorder on the horizon, and the sun, hiding behind them, colors them and the sky with tints of every possible shade: crimson, orange, gold, lilac, muddy pink. One cloud is like a monk, another like a fish, a third like a Turk in a turban. The glow of sunset enveloping a third of the sky gleams on the cross on the church, flashes on the windows of the manor house, is reflected in the river and the puddles, quivers on the trees. Far, far away against the background of the sunset, a flock of wild ducks is flying homewards. And the boy herding the cows, and the surveyor driving in his chaise over the dam, and the gentleman out for a walk, all gaze at the sunset, and every one of them thinks it is terribly beautiful, but no one knows or can say in what its beauty lies. I was not the only one to think the Armenian girl beautiful. My grandfather, an old man of 70, gruff and indifferent to women and the beauties of nature, looked caressingly at Masha for a full minute, and asked, "Is that your daughter, Avert Nazarich?" "Yes, she is my daughter," answered the Armenian. "A fine young lady," said my grandfather approvingly. An artist would have called the Armenian girl's beauty classical and severe. It was just that beauty, the contemplation of which, God knows why, inspires in one the conviction that one is seeing correct features, that hair, eyes, nose, mouth, neck, bosom, and every movement of the young body all go together in one complete harmonious accord in which nature has not blundered over the smallest line. You fancy for some reason that the ideally beautiful woman must have such a nose as Masha's, straight and slightly aquiline, just such great dark eyes, such long lashes, such a languid glance. You fancy that her black curly hair and eyebrows go with the soft white tint of her brow and cheeks as the green reeds go with the quiet stream. Masha's white neck and her youthful bosom were not fully developed, but you fancy the sculptor would need a great creative genius to mold them. You gaze, and little by little the desire comes over you to say to Masha something extraordinarily pleasant, sincere, beautiful as she herself was. At first I felt hurt and abashed that Masha took no notice of me, but was all the time looking down. It seemed to me as though a peculiar atmosphere, proud and happy, separated her from me and jealously screened her from my eyes. That's because I'm covered with dust, I thought, am sunburnt, and am still a boy. But little by little I forgot myself, and gave myself up entirely to the consciousness of beauty. I thought no more now of the dreary steppe, of the dust, no longer heard the buzzing of the flies, no longer tasted the tea, and felt nothing except that a beautiful girl was standing only the other side of the table. I felt this beauty rather strangely. It was not desire, nor ecstasy, nor enjoyment that Masha excited in me, but a painful, though pleasant, sadness. It was a sadness vague and undefined as a dream. For some reason I felt sorry for myself, for my grandfather, and for the Armenian, even for the girl herself, and I had a feeling as though we all four had lost something important and essential to life which we should never find again. My grandfather, too, grew melancholy. He talked no more about manure or about oats, but sat silent, looking pensively at Masha. After tea my grandfather lay down for a nap, while I went out of the house into the porch. The house, like all the houses in the Armenian village, stood in the full sun. There was not a tree, not an awning, no shade. The Armenians' great courtyard, overgrown with goosefoot and wild mallows, was lively and full of gaiety in spite of the great heat. Threshing was going on behind one of the low hurdles, which intersected the big yard here and there. Round a post, stuck into the middle of the threshing floor, ran a dozen horses, harnessed side by side, so that they formed one long radius. A little Russian, in a long waistcoat and full trousers, was walking beside them, cracking a whip, and shouting in a tone that sounded as though he were jeering at the horses, and showing off his power over them. "Ah! Ah! Ah! You damned brutes! Ah! 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 Plague take you! Are you frightened?" The horses, sorrel, white, and piebald, not understanding why they were made to run round in one place and to crush the wheat straw, ran unwillingly, as though with effort, swinging their tails with an offended air. The wind raised up perfect clouds of golden chaff from under their hoofs and carried it away far beyond the hurdle. Near the tall, fresh stacks, peasant women were swarming with rakes, and carts were moving, and beyond the stacks in another yard, another dozen similar horses were running round a post, and a similar little Russian was cracking his whip and jeering at the horses. The steps on which I was sitting were hot. On the thin rails, and here and there on the window frames, sap was oozing out of the wood from the heat. Red ladybirds were huddling together in the streaks of shadow under the steps and under the shutters. The sun was baking me on my head, on my chest, and on my back, but I did not notice it, and was conscious only of the thud of bare feet on the uneven floor, in the passage and in the rooms behind me. After clearing away the tea things, Masha ran down the steps, fluttering the air as she passed, and like a bird flew into a little grimy outhouse, I suppose the kitchen, from which came the smell of roast mutton and the sound of angry talk in Armenian. She vanished into the dark doorway, and in her place there appeared on the threshold an old, bent, red-faced Armenian woman wearing green trousers. The old woman was angry and was scolding someone. Soon afterwards Masha appeared in the doorway, flushed with the heat of the kitchen, and carrying a big black loaf on her shoulder. Swaying gracefully under the weight of the bread, she ran across the yard to the threshing floor, darted over the hurdle, and, wrapped in a cloud of golden chaff, vanished behind the carts. The little Russian who was driving the horses lowered his whip, sank into silence, and gazed for a minute in the direction of the carts. Then, when the Armenian girl darted again by the horses and leaped over the hurdle, he followed her with his eyes, and shouted to the horses in a tone as though he were greatly disappointed. "Plague take you, unclean devils!" And all the while I was unceasingly hearing her bare feet, and seeing how she walked across the yard with a grave, preoccupied face. She ran now down the steps, swishing the air about me, now into the kitchen, now to the threshing floor, now through the gate, and I could hardly turn my head quickly enough to watch her. And the oftener she fluttered by me with her beauty, the more acute became my sadness. I felt sorry both for her and for myself, and for the little Russian, who mournfully watched her every time she ran through the cloud of chaff to the carts. Whether it was envy of her beauty, or that I was regretting that the girl was not mine and never would be, or that I was a stranger to her, or whether I vaguely felt that her rare beauty was accidental, unnecessary, and, like everything on earth, of short duration, or whether perhaps my sadness was that peculiar feeling which is excited in man by the contemplation of real beauty, God only knows. The 3 hours of waiting passed unnoticed. It seemed to me that I had not had time to look properly at Masha when Karpo drove up to the river, bathed the horse, and began to put it in the shafts. The wet horse snorted with pleasure and kicked his hoofs against the shafts. Karpo shouted to it, "Back!" My grandfather woke up. Masha opened the creaking gates for us. We got into the chaise and drove out of the yard. We drove in silence as though we were angry with one another. When, 2 or 3 hours later, Rostov and Nahitchevan appeared in the distance, Karpo, who had been silent the whole time, looked round quickly and said, "A fine wench, that, at the Armenians'," and he lashed the horses. 2. Another time, after I had become a student, I was traveling by rail to the south. It was May. At one of the stations, I believe it was between Byelgorod and Kharkov, I got out of the train to walk about the platform. The shades of evening were already lying on the station garden, on the platform, and on the fields. The station screened off the sunset, but on the topmost clouds of smoke from the engine, which were tinged with rosy light, one could see the sun had not yet quite vanished. As I walked up and down the platform, I noticed that the greater number of the passengers were standing or walking near a second-class compartment, and that they looked as though some celebrated person were in that compartment. Among the curious whom I met near this compartment, I saw, however, an artillery officer who had been my fellow traveler, an intelligent, cordial, and sympathetic fellow, as people mostly are whom we meet on our travels by chance, and with whom we are not long acquainted. "What are you looking at there?" I asked. He made no answer, but only indicated with his eyes a feminine figure. It was a young girl of 17 or 18, wearing a Russian dress, with her head bare and a little shawl flung carelessly on one shoulder. Not a passenger, but I suppose a sister or daughter of the station-master. She was standing near the carriage window, talking to an elderly woman who was in the train. Before I had time to realize what I was seeing, I was suddenly overwhelmed by the feeling I had once experienced in the Armenian village. The girl was remarkably beautiful, and that was unmistakable to me and to those who were looking at her as I was. If one is to describe her appearance feature by feature, as the practice is, the only really lovely thing was her thick, wavy, fair hair, which hung loose with a black ribbon tied round her head. All the other features were either irregular or very ordinary. Either from a peculiar form of coquettishness or from short-sightedness, her eyes were screwed up. Her nose had an undecided tilt. Her mouth was small. Her profile was feebly and insipidly drawn. Her shoulders were narrow and undeveloped for her age. And yet the girl made the impression of being really beautiful, and looking at her I was able to feel convinced that the Russian face does not need strict regularity in order to be lovely. What is more, that if instead of her turn-up nose the girl had been given a different one, correct and plastically irreproachable like the Armenian girls, I fancy her face would have lost all its charm from the change. Standing at the window talking, the girl, shrugging at the evening damp, continually looking round at us, at one moment put her arms akimbo, at the next raised her hands to her head to straighten her hair, talked, laughed, while her face at one moment wore an expression of wonder, the next of horror, and I don't remember a moment when her face and body were at rest. The whole secret and magic of her beauty lay just in these tiny, infinitely elegant movements, in her smile, in the play of her face, in her rapid glances at us, in the combination of the subtle grace of her movements with her youth, her freshness, the purity of her soul that sounded in her laugh and voice, and with the weakness we love so much in children, in birds, in fawns, and in young trees. It was that butterfly's beauty so in keeping with waltzing, darting about the garden, laughter and gaiety, and incongruous with serious thought, grief, and repose. And it seemed as though a gust of wind blowing over the platform, or a fall of rain, would be enough to wither the fragile body and scatter the capricious beauty like the pollen of a flower. "So," the officer muttered with a sigh when, after the second bell, we went back to our compartment. And what that "so" meant, I will not undertake to decide. Perhaps he was sad, and did not want to go away from the beauty and the spring evening into the stuffy train. Or perhaps he, like me, was unaccountably sorry for the beauty, for himself, and for me, and for all the passengers who were listlessly and reluctantly sauntering back to their compartments. As we passed the station window, at which a pale, red-haired telegraphist with upstanding curls and a faded, broad-cheeked face was sitting beside his apparatus, The officer heaved a sigh and said, I bet that telegraphist is in love with that pretty girl. To live out in the wilds under one roof with that ethereal creature and not fall in love is beyond the power of man. And what a calamity, my friend, what an ironical fate, to be stooping, unkempt, gray, a decent fellow and not a fool, and to be in love with that pretty, stupid little girl who would never take a scrap of notice of you. Or worse still, imagine that telegraphist is in love and at the same time married, and that his wife is as stooping, as unkempt, and as decent a person as himself. On the platform between our carriage and the next, the guard was standing with his elbows on the railing, looking in the direction of the beautiful girl, and his battered, wrinkled, unpleasantly beefy face, exhausted by sleepless nights and the jolting of the train, wore a look of tenderness and of the deepest sadness, as though in that girl he saw happiness, his own youth, soberness, purity, wife, children, as though he were repenting and feeling in his whole being that that girl was not his, and that for him, with his premature old age, his uncouthness, and his beefy face, the ordinary happiness of a man and a passenger was as far away as heaven. The third bell rang, the whistles sounded, and the train slowly moved off. First the guard, the station master, then the garden, the beautiful girl with her exquisitely sly smile, passed before our windows. Putting my head out and looking back, I saw how, looking after the train, she walked along the platform by the window where the telegraph clerk was sitting, smoothed her hair, and ran into the garden. The station no longer screened off the sunset. The plain lay open before us, but the sun had already set, and the smoke lay in black clouds over the green, velvety young corn. It was melancholy in the spring air, and in the darkening sky, and in the railway carriage. The familiar figure of the guard came into the carriage, and he began lighting the candles. End of The Beauties by Anton Chekhov.
The Gift of the Magi by O. Henry. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Gift of the Magi by O. Henry. $1.87, that was all, and 60 cents of it was in pennies. Pennies, saved 1 and 2 at a time, by bulldozing the grocer and the vegetable man and the butcher, until one's cheek burned with silent imputation of parsimony that such close stealing implied. 3 times Della counted it, $1.87, and the next day would be Christmas. There was clearly nothing to do but flop down on the shabby little couch and howl, so Della did it, which instigates the moral reflection that life is made up of sobs, sniffles, and smiles, with sniffles predominating. While the mistress of the home is gradually subsiding from the first stage to the second, take a look at the home. A furnished flat at $8 per week. It did not exactly beggar description, but it certainly had that word on the lookout for the mendicancy squad. In the vestibule below was a letterbox into which no letter would go, and an electric button from which no mortal finger could coax a ring. Also appertaining thereunto was a card bearing the name Mr. James Dillingham Young. The Dillingham had been flung to the breeze during a former period of prosperity, when its possessor was being paid $30 per week. Now, when the income was shrunk to 20, though, they were thinking seriously of contracting to a modest and unassuming D. But whenever Mr. James Dillingham Young came home and reached his flat above, he was called Jim, and greatly hugged by Miss James Dillingham Young, already introduced to you as Della, which is all very good. Della finished her cry, and attended to her cheeks with the powder rag. She stood by the window and looked out dully at a gray cat walking a gray fence in a gray backyard. Tomorrow would be Christmas Day, and she had only $1.87 with which to buy Jim a present. She'd been saving every penny she could for months with this result. $20 a week doesn't go far. Expenses had been greater than she had calculated. They always are. Only $1.87 to buy a present for Jim. Her Jim. Many a happy hour she had spent planning for something nice for him. Something fine and rare and sterling. Something just a little bit near to being worthy of the honor of being owned by Jim. There was a pier glass between the windows of the room. Perhaps you have seen a pier glass in an $8 flat. A very thin and very agile person may, by observing his reflection in a rapid sequence of longitudinal strips, obtain a fairly accurate conception of his looks. Della, being slender, had mastered the art. Suddenly she whirled from the window and stood before the glass. Her eyes were shining brilliantly, but her face had lost its color within 20 seconds. Rapidly she pulled down her hair and let it fall to its full length. Now there were two possessions of the James Dillingham Youngs in which they both took a mighty pride. One was Jim's gold watch that had been his father's and his grandfather's. The other was Della's hair. Had the Queen of Sheba lived in the flat across the air shaft, Della would have let her hair hung out the window some day to dry just to depreciate Her Majesty's jewels and gifts. Had King Solomon been the janitor with all his treasure piled up in the basement, Jim would have pulled out his watch every time he passed, just to see him pluck at his beard from envy. So now Della's beautiful hair fell about her, rippling and shining like a cascade of brown waters. It reached below her knee and made itself almost a garment for her, and then she did it up again, nervously and quickly. Once she faltered for a minute, and stood still while a tear or two splashed on the worn red carpet. On went her old brown jacket. On went her old brown hat. With a whirl of skirts and with the brilliant sparkle still in her eyes, she fluttered out the door and down the stairs to the street, where she stopped. The sign read, Madame Safrane, hair goods of all kinds. One flight up Della ran and collected herself, panting. Madame, large, too white, chilly, hardly looked the Safrane. "Will you buy my hair?" asked Della. "I buy hair," said Madame. "Take your hat off and let's have a sight at the looks of it." Down rippled the brown cascade. $20, said Madame, lifting the mass with a practised hand. "Give it to me quick," said Della. Oh, and the next 2 hours tripped by on rosy wings. Forget the hashed metaphor. She was ransacking the stores for Jim's present. She found it at last. It surely had been made for Jim and no one else. There was no other like it in any of the stores, and she had turned all of them inside out. It was a platinum phobe chain, simple and chaste in design, properly proclaiming its value by substance alone and not by meretricious ornamentation, as all good things should do. It was even worthy of the watch. As soon as she saw it, she knew that it must be Jim's. It was like him, quietness and value. The description applied to both. $21 they took from her for it, and she hurried home with the 87 cents. With that chain on his watch, Jim might be properly anxious about the time in any company. Grand as the watch was, he sometimes looked at it on the sly on account of the old leather strap that he used in place of a chain. When Della reached home, her intoxication gave way a little to prudence and reason. She got out her curling irons and lighted the gas and went on to work repairing the ravages made by generosity added to love, which is always a tremendous task, dear friends, a mammoth task. Within 40 minutes her head was covered with tiny, close-lying curls that made her look wonderfully like a truant schoolboy. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, long, carefully and critically. "If Jim doesn't kill me," she said to herself, "before he takes a second look at me, he'll say I look like a Coney Island chorus girl. But what could I do? Oh, what could I do with $1.87? At 7 o'clock the coffee was made, and the frying pan was on the back of the stove hot and ready to cook the chops. Jim was never late. Della doubled the fob chain in her hand and sat on the corner of the table near the door that he always entered. Then she heard his step on the stair way down on the first flight, and she turned white for just a moment. She had had a habit of saying a little silent prayer about the simplest everyday things, and now she whispered, "Please, God, make him think I am still pretty." The door opened, and Jim stepped in and closed it. He looked thin and very serious. Poor fellow, he was only 22, and to be burdened with a family. He needed a new overcoat, and he was without gloves. Jim stopped inside the door, as immovable as a setter at the scent of a quail. His eyes were fixed upon Della, and there was an expression in them that she could not read, and it terrified her. It was not anger, nor surprise, nor disapproval, nor horror, nor any of the sentiments that she had been prepared for. He simply stared at her fixedly with that peculiar expression on his face. Della wriggled off the table and went for him. "Jim, darling," she cried, "don't look at me that way. I had my hair cut off and sold because I couldn't have lived through Christmas without giving you a present. It'll grow out again. You won't mind, will you? I just had to do it. My hair grows awfully fast. Say Merry Christmas, Jim, and let's be happy. You don't know what a beautiful nice gift I've got for you. You've cut off your hair, asked Jim, laboriously, as if he had not arrived at the patent fact yet, even after the hardest mental labor. Cut it off and sold it, said Della. Don't you like me just as well, anyhow? I'm me without my hair, ain't I? Jim looked about the room curiously. You say your hair is gone, he said, with an air almost of idiocy. You needn't look for it, said Della. It's sold, I'll tell you, sold and gone too. It's Christmas Eve, boy. Be good to me, for it went for you. Maybe the hairs of my head were numbered, she went on with sudden serious sweetness, but nobody could ever count my love for you. Shall I put the chops on, Jim? Out of his trance, Jim seemed quickly to awake. He enfolded his Della. For 10 seconds, let us regard with discreet scrutiny some inconsequential object in the other direction. $8 a week, or $1 million a year. What is the difference? A mathematician or a wit would give you the wrong answer. The Magi brought valuable gifts, but that was not among them. This dark assertion will be illuminated later on. Jim drew a package from his overcoat pocket and threw it upon the table. Don't make any mistake, Dell, he said, about me. I don't think there's anything in a way of a haircut or a shave or a shampoo that could make me like my girl any less. But if you'll unwrap that package, you may see why you had me going a while at first. White fingers and nimble tore at the string in the paper, and then an ecstatic scream of joy, and then, alas, a quick feminine change to hysterical tears and wails, necessitating the immediate employment of all the comforting powers of the lord of the flat. For there lay the combs, the set of combs side and back, that Della had worshipped long in a Broadway window. But beautiful combs, pure tortoiseshell, with jeweled rims, just the shade to wear in the beautiful vanished hair. They were expensive combs, she knew, and her heart had simply craved and yearned over them without the least hope of possession. And now they were hers, but the tresses that should have adorned the coveted adornments were gone. But she hugged them to her bosom, and at length she was able to look up with the dim eyes and a smile and said, My hair grows fast, Jim. And then Della leaped up like a little sing cat and cried, Oh, oh! Jim had not yet seen his beautiful present. She held it out to him eagerly upon her open palm. The dull, precious metal seemed to flash with the reflection of her bright and ardent spirit. Isn't it dandy, Jim? I hunted all over town to find it. You have to look at the time 100 times a day now. Give me your watch. I want to see how it looks on it. Instead of obeying, Jim tumbled down on the couch and put his hands under the back of his head and smiled. Dell, said he, let's put our Christmas presents away and keep 'em a while. They're too nice to use just at present. I sold the watch to get the money to buy your combs, and now suppose you put the chops on. The Magi, as you know, were wise men, wonderfully wise men, who brought gifts to the babe in the manger. They invented the art of giving Christmas presents. Being wise, their gifts were no doubt wise ones, possibly bearing the privilege of exchange in case of duplication. And here I have lamely related to you the uneventful chronicle of 2 foolish children in a flat, who most unwisely sacrificed for each other the greatest treasures of their house. But in a last word to the wise of these days, let it be said that of all who give gifts, these 2 were the wisest. Of all who give and receive gifts, such as they are wisest. Everywhere they are wisest. They are the Magi. This is the end of The Gift of the Magi.